Red Hollow wasn't the kind of place you stumbled into by accident. It sat in a valley where three territorial roads met, surrounded by land that could either make you rich or bury you, depending on how hard you were willing to work and how much you were willing to sacrifice. The town had grown up around cattle drives and mining claims, built by people who understood that survival meant taking what you could and holding it tight. Sheriff Dalton Creed understood that better than anyone. He'd come to Red Hollow 15 years ago with nothing but a badge and a reputation for settling disputes with finality. Now he owned half the commercial buildings on Main Street, leased grazing rights on 1,000 acres of prime rangeland, and sat on the town council with enough influence to swing any vote he wanted. His ranch house, 3 stories of imported timber and glass windows that caught the setting sun like flames, stood on the hill overlooking everything, a constant reminder of who held power. But Creed's real power came from something more valuable than property, his daughters. He had 3 of them, each one groomed and displayed like prize livestock. Margaret, the eldest at 23, had honey-colored hair that she wore in elaborate styles copied from fashion plates shipped from St. Louis. She could play piano, spoke decent French, and had turned down 4 marriage proposals in 2 years because none of the suitors met her father's standards for wealth and standing. Catherine, 21, was quieter but no less polished, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with a talent for numbers that made her invaluable in managing the ranch accounts. Then there was Victoria, 19, who combined beauty with a personality that could charm investors and intimidate competitors in equal measure. And then there was Eliza. But nobody talked about Eliza. The bride's trial had started 7 years ago, born from Creed's genius for turning social events into demonstrations of power. Every autumn, when the harvest was in and the cattle drives complete, eligible men from across the territory would gather in Red Hollow for 3 days of competition. Horse racing, marksmanship, poker, even debates on politics and philosophy, each event designed to showcase different kinds of strength and skill. The winner earned the right to court one of Sheriff Creed's daughters. Not marry, mind you, just court. The actual engagement still required Creed's approval, which meant the real competition didn't end when the games did. But that possibility, that chance, drew ambitious men like moths to a flame. Merchants' sons who wanted to elevate their standing, ranch hands who dreamed of owning their own spreads. Even a few educated men from back east who saw frontier opportunity and imagined themselves as pioneers building empires. This year's trial had drawn 23 contestants. Caleb Vance wasn't one of them. He'd ridden into Red Hollow on a Tuesday afternoon 2 weeks before the trial's official start, leading a pair of pack horses loaded with supplies and gear that looked like it had seen hard use. The town's first impression of him was dust and silence. He was covered in the former and wrapped in the latter, offering minimal words to the stable hand who took his horses and even fewer to the clerk at the general store where he bought flour, coffee, and ammunition. He was maybe 30, though the lines around his eyes suggested he'd lived more than his years. Medium height, lean in the way men get when they work hard and don't eat enough, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving. His clothes were clean but worn, his boots were good quality but broken in, and everything about him said he'd been on the trail for a while. Nobody would have given him a second thought, except for what happened at the Silver Bell Saloon. But the Silver Bell occupied the corner of Main and 3rd, a 2-story building with a false front that made it look more impressive than it was. Inside, the usual crowd had gathered, ranch hands spending their wages, merchants escaping their wives, and a handful of bride's trial contestants trying to take each other's measure over cards and whiskey. Caleb had taken a table in the back, alone, working his way through a plate of beef and beans that probably cost twice what it was worth. He wasn't bothering anyone, wasn't looking for conversation, just eating his meal and minding his own business. That should have been enough. You here for the trial? The question came from a man named Porter Hayes, son of the territory's largest cattle broker and one of the favorites to win. He was built like his father's bulls, thick-shouldered and aggressive, with red gold hair and the kind of confidence that came from never having to question whether you belonged somewhere. Caleb looked up from his plate. No. Good thing. Porter pulled out a chair without being invited, turning it backward and straddling it. Takes a certain kind of man to compete. Property, prospects, breeding. Not just any drifter can walk in and think he's got a chance. Three of Porter's friends had materialized around the table, forming a casual semicircle that wasn't casual at all. The saloon's noise level had dropped slightly. Not enough to be obvious, but enough that people were paying attention. "I'm not competing," Caleb said again, his voice flat. "See, that's a smart choice." Porter grinned, but there was something cold behind it. "Because the sheriff's daughters, they're meant for men who can provide. Men with futures. Not some saddle tramp who probably doesn't have two coins to rub together." Caleb set down his fork with careful precision. "You done?" "Just being friendly. Helping you understand how things work in Red Hollow." Porter's grin widened. "Sheriff Creed doesn't take kindly to men who don't know their place, and right now, your place is passing through." The tension in the room had become palpable. The bartender had stopped pouring. A card game at the next table had gone quiet mid-deal. Caleb stood up slowly, and for a moment Porter's friends tensed, hands drifting toward their belts. But Caleb just reached into his pocket and dropped a silver dollar on the table. More than enough for the meal. "Appreciate the advice," he said, and started walking toward the door. He made it halfway before Porter's voice followed him. "That's right. Run along. Wouldn't want you embarrassing yourself by trying to compete with real men." Caleb stopped. Later people would argue about what happened next. Some said Porter stood up first. Others swore Caleb turned around with his fists already clenched. But everyone agreed on two things. The fight was brutal, and it was fast. Porter outweighed Caleb by 40 pounds, but weight meant nothing when you didn't know how to use it. Caleb fought like someone who'd learned in places where losing meant dying. No wasted movement, no hesitation, no mercy. He ducked Porter's first wild swing, drove his shoulder into the bigger man's ribs, and followed with a combination of strikes that sent Porter stumbling back into his friends. Two of them jumped in. That was their mistake. Caleb broke the first one's nose with an elbow, kicked the second one's knee hard enough to drop him, and was back on Porter before anyone could blink. They crashed through a table, sending cards and coins flying. Porter got his hands around Caleb's throat, but Caleb drove his thumbs into pressure points below Porter's jaw until the grip loosened, then headbutted him hard enough to split both their foreheads. When the sheriff's deputies finally pulled them apart, Porter was on the floor with blood streaming from his mouth, and Caleb was being held back by three men, still trying to get loose. Sheriff Creed himself showed up 20 minutes later. He walked into the saloon like he owned it, which, technically, he did, and surveyed the damage with the expression of a man calculating costs. His gaze moved from the broken table to Porter Hayes being tended by the town doctor to Caleb Vance standing against the bar with his hands cuffed and blood still dripping from his knuckles. "Who started it?" Creed asked. "Hayes did, sir," the bartender said immediately. "This fellow was leaving. Hayes called him out." Creed's eyes narrowed slightly. "That true, Porter?" Porter, holding a cloth to his bleeding mouth, couldn't meet the sheriff's gaze. "We were just talking. Did you start the fight?" A long pause, then barely audible. "Yes, sir." Creed nodded slowly, then looked at his deputies. "Uncuff him." "Sir?" one of them asked. "You heard me. Man has a right to defend himself." Creed waited until Caleb's hands were free, then stepped closer, studying him with the intensity of someone evaluating livestock. "What's your name?" "Caleb Vance." "Where you from, Caleb Vance?" "Montana Territory. Before that, Wyoming. Before that, a lot of places." "What brings you to Red Hollow?" "Passing through on my way to Colorado. Thought I'd rest the horses. Resupply." "Passing through." Creed smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You know what the problem is with men who are just passing through? They don't have stakes, don't have reputation to protect, don't have anything to lose. Makes them unpredictable." Caleb said nothing. "You fight like you've done it before," Creed continued. "Like you've done it a lot. Military?" "No." "Prison?" "No." "Then where'd you learn to handle yourself like that?" "Life." The answer hung in the air between them. Around the saloon, men were watching, waiting to see how this would play out. Sheriff Creed held power through a careful balance of force and legitimacy, and right now, everyone wanted to know which way the scales would tip. Then Creed did something unexpected. He laughed. "I like you, Vance. You've got spine." He glanced at Porter, still bleeding and humiliated. "More spine than some who were born with advantages and never had to earn them." He turned back to Caleb. You planning to stay for the bride's trial? No. Why not? You don't think you could compete? Didn't say that. Said I wasn't planning to. But if you did plan to, you think you'd have a chance? Caleb met his gaze directly. Against men like him? He nodded toward Porter. Yeah, I think I'd have a chance. The saloon went dead silent. Sheriff Creed's smile slowly faded into something more calculating. You understand what you're saying? The bride's trial isn't just games and contests. It's about proving you're worthy of joining one of the territory's most prominent families. It requires property, prospects, standing. It requires winning, Caleb interrupted quietly. Everything else is just decoration. For a long moment, Creed didn't move. Then, gradually his smile returned, but this time it was different, sharper, more predatory. You're right, he said softly. It does require winning. And I'll tell you what, Vance, I'm going to give you a chance. Not through the trial. That's for men with something to prove to the whole territory. No, I'm going to give you a private challenge, one task. You complete it, you can have your choice of my daughters. You fail, he shrugged. You leave Red Hollow and don't come back. The room erupted in murmurs. This had never happened before. The bride's trial was sacred tradition, and Creed was offering to bypass it entirely for a complete stranger? What's the task? Caleb asked. Creed's smile widened. I have a horse, Black Stallion, 5 years old. Bought him off a breeder in Kentucky who swore he had champion bloodlines. Beautiful animal, powerful, fast, smart. He paused. Also completely unmanageable. He's thrown every rider who's tried him, put 2 men in the doctor's office and damn near killed my best horse trainer. I've been trying to break him for 8 months with no success. You want me to break him? I want you to tame him, ride him into town square in front of the whole territory. Show me he's not just broken, but truly trained, responsive, controlled, rideable. Do that within, Creed pretended to think. Let's say 3 months. Do that, and you can court whichever of my daughters strikes your fancy. Fail, and you leave with nothing but the horse's hoof prints on your backside. The murmurs grew louder. Men were shaking their heads, laughing, already dismissing Caleb as a fool. Even the doctor, still tending to Porter, looked skeptical. 3 months, Caleb repeated. That's right. And I'll even be generous. You can stay at my ranch while you work with him. Room and board provided. Can't say fairer than that. It was a trap. Everyone in the room could see it. The horse was impossible. The timeline was impossible. And even if by some miracle Caleb succeeded, Creed would find a way to twist the outcome. The sheriff didn't make bets he could lose. Caleb should have seen it too. But he was looking at Sheriff Creed's face, at that smug certainty, and something in him, something stubborn and angry and tired of being told what he couldn't do, made the decision before his brain could stop it. Deal. Creed's smile turned triumphant. Excellent. You can start tomorrow. He extended his hand. Caleb shook it, feeling calluses that had gone soft from years of delegating manual labor. Creed's grip was firm, but not strong, the kind of handshake that came from practice rather than use. One more thing, Creed added, not letting go. When I said you could choose whichever daughter strikes your fancy, I meant it. But I should tell you, the one who usually catches a man's eye is Margaret. Beautiful, cultured, perfect for a man looking to establish himself in society. That's who most men would choose. The message was clear. That's who you should choose. Caleb pulled his hand free. We'll see. As he walked out of the Silver Bell, he could hear the conversation exploding behind him. Laughter, speculation, bets already being placed on how long it would take the horse to put him in the ground. He ignored it all, focusing on the cooling night air and the feeling that he'd just made either the best or worst decision of his life. He didn't know yet that both were true. The Creed Ranch sprawled across the hillside like a small kingdom, with the main house at its center and various outbuildings radiating outward in careful organization. Stables, bunkhouse, smithy, storage barns, a separate building that looked like offices, everything maintained with the kind of precision that came from money and expectations. Caleb arrived at dawn, leading his pack horses and trying not to feel out of place. A ranch hand met him at the gate, a weathered man in his 50s with suspicious eyes and a manner that suggested he'd seen every kind of trouble and wasn't impressed by any of it. You the fool who made the bet? He asked. I'm Caleb Vance. Same thing. The man spat tobacco juice into the dust. Name's Garrett. I run the horse operation here. Sheriff says I'm supposed to show you the stallion and get you set up in the bunkhouse. He paused. Also supposed to tell you where the doctor lives, for when you need him. Appreciate the confidence. Ain't confidence, it's experience. Garrett started walking toward the stables. Had 5 men try that horse before you. 3 of them quit after the first day. 2 stuck it out longer, thinking they were tough enough. 1 still got a limp. The other one sees double when he's tired. The stables were impressive. 20 stalls, all clean, all well maintained. Most held horses that looked like money. Sleek riding mounts, strong work animals, a few that were clearly being trained for specialized purposes. Garrett led him past all of them to the last stall on the end, which was larger than the others and reinforced with extra boards. Here's your challenge. The horse was everything Creed had promised, and more. He stood 17 hands at least, coal black, except for a small white star on his forehead. Even standing still, he radiated power, thick muscles, strong legs, a chest like a barrel. But it was his eyes that caught Caleb's attention. Dark, intelligent, and absolutely furious. The moment the horse saw them, his ears went flat, and he lunged at the stall door hard enough to rattle the reinforcements. The sound echoed through the stable, and several of the other horses shifted nervously in response. Jesus, Caleb breathed. We call him Midnight, Garrett said. Original, I know. Had other names for him too, but none fit for repeating in polite company. He leaned against the stable wall, studying Caleb. You ever worked with a horse this rank before? No. Then you got no idea what you're in for. That animal isn't just untrained, he's mean. Got it in his head that humans are enemies, and nothing we've done has changed his mind. We tried patience, tried firmness, tried everything in between. He just gets worse. Caleb moved closer to the stall, moving slow and keeping his hands visible. Midnight tracked his approach, muscles tensing, ready to explode at any provocation. Up close, Caleb could see scars along the horse's flanks and neck, some old, some relatively fresh. What happened to him? Don't know. Sheriff bought him at auction, said the breeder claimed he had perfect bloodlines but a difficult temperament. Turned out difficult meant dangerous. Garrett shrugged. My guess? Somebody tried to break him hard and fast, probably used whips and spurs and whatever else they thought would work. All it did was convince him that fighting back was the only option. Caleb knew that feeling. Can I see him outside the stall? You mean in the paddock? Sure, if you got a death wish. Garrett straightened up. But I'll do it. Not because I think it's smart, but because you'll just try it yourself if I don't, and at least this way there's 2 of us to scrape you off the ground. It took 30 minutes and 3 ranch hands to move Midnight from his stall to the large paddock behind the stables. The horse fought every step, rearing and striking out with hooves that could crack a man's skull like an egg. When they finally got him through the gate and removed the lead rope, he immediately put as much distance as possible between himself and the humans, then wheeled around to face them with his head high and nostrils flaring. Satisfied? Garrett asked. Caleb didn't answer. He was watching the way Midnight moved, the slight hitch in his left rear leg, the way he held his head a fraction too high, the tension in every line of his body. This wasn't just aggression, this was fear wrapped in fury, wrapped in pain. He's hurt, Caleb said. He's fine. Doc checked him out months ago. He's favoring his left rear. And look at how he's holding his neck. Something's not right. Garrett frowned, looking at the horse more carefully. He's been moving like that since we got him. Figured it was just his temperament. Maybe. Or maybe he's been in pain this whole time, and everyone who tried to ride him just made it worse. It was a guess, but it felt right. Caleb had seen enough injured animals and injured men to recognize the signs. The way pain changed everything, made you defensive and aggressive because you couldn't afford to show weakness. So what are you going to do? Garrett asked. You ain't got 3 months to nurse him back to health. You got 3 months to ride him in front of the whole territory. I know. And you still think you can do it? Caleb watched Midnight pacing the paddock fence, looking for a way out that didn't exist. Ask me in a month. The bunkhouse was basic but clean, a long room with 8 beds, a wood stove, and windows that let in morning light. Most of the beds were empty. Ranch hands were already out working. Caleb took the one closest to the door, unpacked his gear, and tried to figure out what he'd gotten himself into. 3 months to tame a horse that had broken better men than him. 3 months to prove he was worthy of a woman he'd never met. 3 months to show Sheriff Dalton Creed that he wasn't just another drifter who could be dismissed and forgotten. It sounded insane when he put it that way. You must be the new entertainment. The voice came from the doorway. Caleb turned to find a woman standing there, mid-20s, wearing a plain work dress and an apron covered in what looked like flour. She had brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, strong hands, and an expression that suggested she'd already formed an opinion and wasn't particularly impressed. "Caleb Vance," he said. "I know. Whole ranch knows. You're the fool who bet he could tame Midnight." She wiped her hands on her apron. "I'm Mary, the cook. Breakfast is at 5, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. You miss it, you go hungry. We don't accommodate special schedules." "Understood." "Good." She started to leave, then paused. "Fair warning, most of the hands are betting on how long you last. Current odds say you'll quit within 2 weeks, with a minority position that you'll end up too injured to continue before then. Nobody betting I'll succeed?" "One person?" Mary's expression softened slightly. "But she bets on lost causes regular, so I wouldn't put much stock in it." Before Caleb could ask who she meant, Mary was gone. He spent the rest of the day getting oriented, learning the ranch's layout, meeting the other hands, understanding the daily routines. Most of the men were polite but distant, treating him like a temporary curiosity. A few offered advice, usually some variation of "don't get killed" or "the doctor's office is 2 blocks west of the town square." It wasn't until dinner that he saw any of the Creed family. The ranch hands ate in the bunkhouse, but the food came from the main house kitchen, carried over by Mary and 2 younger women who helped with cooking and cleaning. Caleb was finishing his plate when the bunkhouse door opened and Sheriff Creed walked in, followed by a woman who could only be one of his daughters. Margaret Creed looked exactly like her reputation. Beautiful in a way that seemed almost constructed, with perfect posture, perfect hair, perfect everything. She wore an evening dress that must have cost more than Caleb earned in a year, and she moved through the bunkhouse like someone touring a zoo, curious but carefully separated from the animals. "Gentlemen," Creed announced, and the room went quiet. "I wanted to introduce you to my eldest daughter, Margaret, since Mr. Vance here will be working toward earning the privilege of her company." Margaret offered a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, gave a small wave, and said nothing. "Margaret wanted to see the man brave enough, or foolish enough, to accept my challenge," Creed continued. "What do you think, my dear? Does he look like someone who might succeed?" Her gaze swept over Caleb with the same careful distance she'd used on everything else in the room. "He looks determined." "Determined? Yes," Creed chuckled. "Well, we'll see if determination is enough. Come along, Margaret. We've seen what we came to see." They left, and the bunkhouse slowly returned to normal conversation. But Caleb sat there, staring at his empty plate, feeling something he couldn't quite name. That was the prize he was working toward. That perfect, distant, carefully constructed woman who looked at him like he was an interesting specimen, but not quite human? "Don't take it personal," one of the older hands said quietly. "Miss Margaret, she's been raised to think of herself as better than working folks. Sheriff's done it to all his daughters, more or less, except—" He stopped himself. "Except who?" "Nothing. Never mind." The hand stood up, gathering his plate. "Get some sleep, Vance. You start working with that devil horse tomorrow. You'll need it." Caleb tried, but sleep came hard, and when it finally did, he dreamed of black horses and impossible tasks, and women who looked through him like glass. He woke before dawn, dressed, and headed to the stables before breakfast. Midnight was waiting, ears flat, already angry. "All right," Caleb said quietly. "Let's figure this out together." The horse's response was to charge the stall door. It was going to be a long 3 months. The first week nearly killed him. Not from the horse, though Midnight tried his best, but from the slow, grinding realization that everything Caleb thought he knew about working with animals was useless here. Every approach he'd learned, every technique he'd seen other men use, every scrap of conventional wisdom about breaking horses, none of it worked. On the 3rd day, Midnight caught him with a glancing kick to the ribs that sent him sprawling in the paddock dust, unable to breathe for 30 seconds that felt like hours. Garrett found him there, still gasping, and helped him to his feet without a word. The old horse trainer's expression said everything. "I told you so." "You need to see the doctor?" Garrett asked. No. Caleb spat dust and straightened carefully, feeling fire along his right side. Just bruised. Today it's bruised. Tomorrow it's cracked. Day after that, it's broken. Garrett pulled a pouch of tobacco from his pocket, started rolling a cigarette with practiced ease. You're going about this wrong, you know. Yeah? How should I go about it? That's the problem. There ain't a right way with that horse. He's too far gone. Sheriff knows it. I know it. And deep down, you know it too. Only reason you're still trying is pride. He lit the cigarette, took a long drag. Question is whether your pride's worth dying for it. Caleb looked at Midnight, who'd retreated to the far corner of the paddock and stood there watching them with that same furious wariness. The horse's coat gleamed in the morning sun, muscles rippling under black hide, and for just a moment Caleb saw something in those dark eyes that wasn't anger. It was exhaustion. He's not too far gone, Caleb said quietly. He's just been hurt by people who didn't care about understanding him. They just wanted to dominate him. Understanding don't break a horse. Persistence does. Force does. Maybe that's why it didn't work. Garrett snorted. You sound like... He stopped himself, shook his head. Never mind. You want to waste 3 months getting kicked and bit and thrown? That's your business. Just don't expect me to feel bad when you end up like the others. He walked away, leaving Caleb alone with his bruised ribs and his stubborn refusal to admit defeat. By the end of the first week, Caleb had collected an impressive array of injuries. The bruised ribs, a deep cut on his forearm from a splinter when Midnight kicked the fence hard enough to crack a board, rope burns on both hands from trying to hold him on a lead, and a spectacular bruise across his shoulder where he dodged a bite and hit the paddock fence instead. He was also no closer to riding the horse than when he'd started. What he had learned was that Midnight operated on a hair trigger of violence. Any sudden movement, any raised voice, any attempt at physical restraint, all of it provoked the same explosive response. The horse didn't just resist, he attacked. And he was smart about it, watching for patterns, adapting his tactics, always looking for the angle that would do maximum damage. Caleb started bringing his meals to the paddock fence, eating while Midnight watched from a distance. He didn't try to approach, didn't try to offer food or make friends, just sat there, letting the horse get used to his presence without pressure. It felt like doing nothing. Probably was doing nothing. But he didn't have better ideas. On the 8th day, everything changed. Caleb arrived at the paddock before dawn, same as always, and found someone already there. She was sitting on the top rail of the fence, perfectly balanced despite the dew-slick wood, wearing a simple dress that had been mended in several places and boots that were worn but well-maintained. Her hair was brown, pulled back in a practical braid, and she was completely focused on the horse in front of her. So focused, she didn't notice Caleb's approach until he was 10 feet away. When she did notice, her reaction was immediate. She startled, lost her balance, and would have fallen if Caleb hadn't moved fast enough to catch her arm. Sorry, he said quickly. Didn't mean to scare you. She pulled free from his grip the moment she had her footing, stepping back with a wariness that reminded him of Midnight. I shouldn't be here. I'll go. You don't have to. I was just... But she was already walking away, moving fast despite a slight limp that Caleb hadn't noticed until now. Wait, what's your name? She paused, but didn't turn around. Eliza. Then she was gone, disappearing around the corner of the stable before Caleb could say anything else. He stood there feeling like he'd just failed a test he didn't know he was taking. That's the sheriff's other daughter, a voice said behind him. Caleb turned to find one of the younger ranch hands, a kid named Tommy, who couldn't be more than 17, leaning against the stable wall with a pitchfork in hand. I thought he had 3 daughters. He does. Margaret, Catherine, and Victoria. Those are the ones he shows off. Eliza's the one he keeps hidden. Tommy shifted uncomfortably. Not supposed to talk about it. Ranch rules. Why does he keep her hidden? Tommy looked away. You got eyes. Figure it out yourself. The kid walked off before Caleb could press for details, leaving him with more questions than answers. He thought about the brief glimpse he'd gotten of Eliza. The mended dress, the worn boots, the way she'd watched Midnight with such complete attention. What had she seen in that horse that made her lose track of everything else? He climbed up on the fence rail where she'd been sitting and looked at Midnight from that angle. The horse was standing in his usual corner, head high, watching. But something about his posture was different, less tense, almost calm. What was she doing? Caleb asked quietly. Midnight's ears flicked forward, then back. He shifted his weight, favoring that left rear leg again, and suddenly Caleb understood. She hadn't been trying to train the horse. She'd been watching him. Really watching, with patience and attention and no agenda beyond understanding. How long had she been there before Caleb arrived? An hour? More? Just sitting quietly, letting the horse exist without demands or expectations or violence. It was so simple it felt like stupidity. But it was also the first thing that had made sense since this whole mess started. Caleb spent the next hour sitting on that fence rail, not moving, not talking, just being present. Midnight watched him the whole time, waiting for the trap, for the moment when this human would reveal his true intentions. It never came. Eventually, the horse got bored and started grazing on the sparse grass growing along the paddock edge. It wasn't progress. Not really, but it felt like the beginning of something. That night at dinner, Caleb tried to find out more about Eliza. The ranch hands were surprisingly close-mouthed about it, offering vague deflections or changing the subject entirely. Even Mary the cook, who seemed willing to speak her mind on most topics, went quiet when he asked. "That's family business," she finally said. "And you're not family. Leave it alone." But leaving it alone felt wrong, especially when Caleb started noticing the small things that didn't add up. The Creed family ate dinner in the main house every evening. He could see the dining room windows lit up, shadows moving behind expensive curtains. Sheriff Creed, his wife, and 3 daughters all dressed in their finest, sharing a meal that was probably served on china plates with silver cutlery. But there were only 5 silhouettes, never 6. Where did Eliza eat? He found out 2 days later when he came back from working with Midnight and saw her leaving the bunkhouse kitchen with a plate of food. She moved quickly, keeping her head down, and when she saw Caleb, she changed direction entirely, taking the long way around the stable to avoid passing close to him. She was eating alone, in her room probably, or somewhere else away from the family. The realization made something twist in Caleb's chest. He knew what it felt like to be excluded, to be the one people looked past or looked away from. He'd spent his whole life being that person, too poor, too rough, too much of a drifter to belong anywhere that mattered. He'd thought marrying into the Creed family would change that. But what if the family itself was built on exclusion? What if joining it just meant becoming part of the machinery that crushed people like him, like Eliza, into invisibility? He pushed the thought away. It didn't matter. He had a bet to win, a horse to tame, and a future to secure. Margaret Creed was the prize, not some girl who got hidden away like an embarrassment. Except he kept seeing Eliza at the paddock fence. She showed up every morning before dawn, always sitting in the same spot, always watching Midnight with that complete attention. She never acknowledged Caleb when he arrived, never spoke, never did anything except watch. And every time, Midnight would gradually relax in her presence, moving more naturally, grazing more, showing glimpses of what he might be like if he wasn't constantly braced for attack. After 5 days of this silent routine, Caleb's patience finally broke. "What are you seeing?" he asked. Eliza flinched, but didn't run this time. She kept her eyes on Midnight. "I'm not seeing anything." "You watch him for an hour every morning. You're seeing something." A long silence. Then, "He's in pain." "I know. I told Garrett about the limp, but not just the leg." She finally looked at Caleb, and he was struck by how direct her gaze was. No coyness, no social performance, just straight honesty. "His whole body hurts. Look at how he holds his head. Look at the tension in his back. He's been compensating for that rear leg so long that everything else is out of alignment. Every time someone tries to ride him, it makes the pain worse, so he fights harder, which makes them force him harder, which creates more pain." Caleb looked at the horse with new eyes, trying to see what she saw. "How do you know this?" "I watch, and I ask questions that people don't want to answer." She shifted on the fence rail, adjusting her weight off that bad leg. "The breeder who sold him to my father used a technique called breaking. You tie them down, exhaust them, hurt them until they stop fighting. It doesn't actually train them, it just teaches them that resistance brings pain. So when someone tries to ride them later, all that trauma comes back." Jesus. Most people don't care about the why. They just want the result. A horse that obeys. Her voice was flat, but there was something underneath it. Old anger, old pain. They don't understand that fear isn't the same as respect, and submission isn't the same as trust. Caleb studied her profile. The strong line of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, the way she sat despite her limp like she belonged there and didn't care who thought otherwise. This wasn't the timid girl who'd run away when he startled her. This was someone who'd learned to hide what she knew because showing it made people uncomfortable. "Can he be helped?" Caleb asked. Caleb, "Maybe, if someone was willing to do it right. But that takes time and patience and actually caring about the horse instead of just seeing him as a challenge to dominate." The implied criticism landed like a slap. "You think I'm trying to dominate him? I think you made a bet you can't win." She slid down from the fence, landing awkwardly because of her leg. "And I think Midnight is going to suffer for it, because you're not going to give up until you've proven whatever you're trying to prove to yourself. Or to my father." She started to walk away, and this time Caleb didn't try to stop her. He just sat there, feeling the bruises and cuts and rope burns that had become familiar over the past 2 weeks, thinking about everything she'd said. She was right. He was trying to dominate Midnight, not through cruelty maybe, but through sheer stubborn refusal to quit. He told himself it was different from what the others had done, but the result was the same. A horse under constant pressure. A battle neither of them could win. And for what? So he could prove to Sheriff Creed and Porter Hayes and everyone else in Red Hollow that he wasn't just some drifter they could dismiss? So he could marry a woman who looked at him like he was barely worth noticing? The thought sat in his stomach like spoiled food. That evening, instead of nursing his injuries and planning his next assault on Midnight's defenses, Caleb went to the small ranch library, really just a room in the main house where Sheriff Creed kept books for show. He half expected to be turned away, but the housekeeper just pointed him toward it without comment. The collection was mostly legal texts and accounting ledgers, but tucked away on a bottom shelf, he found what he was looking for: a worn copy of The Horse in Motion by Edward Muybridge, and another book on veterinary care for large animals. He took both back to the bunkhouse and read by lamplight until his eyes burned. The next morning, he approached Midnight differently. No rope, no bridle, no attempts at control. He just stood near the paddock fence and watched, trying to see what Eliza saw. The way the horse moved when no one was pressuring him. The moments when pain flashed across his face. The careful way he distributed weight to avoid putting pressure on that rear leg. After an hour, Caleb left. Didn't try to make contact, didn't push for progress, just observed. The following morning, same thing. And the morning after that, Garrett noticed on the 4th day. "You giving up?" "No, I'm starting over." "Starting over? You got less than 11 weeks left." "I know." Caleb didn't take his eyes off Midnight. "Tell me something. When you were trying to train him, did you ever just watch, without trying to achieve anything?" "Watch what? A horse standing there?" "Yeah," Garrett snorted. "That's called wasting time." "Maybe. Or maybe you can't understand something if you're always trying to control it." The old trainer shook his head and walked away, muttering about fools and lost causes. But Caleb kept watching, and slowly, patterns emerged. Midnight was calmer in the early morning, before the ranch fully woke up and filled with noise and activity. He grazed more on the east side of the paddock, where the grass was better. When he was truly relaxed, his left ear would swivel independently of his right, tracking sounds while his body stayed loose. And there were moments, rare, fleeting moments, when something like curiosity would flicker across his face before the defensive anger slammed back into place. 2 weeks into Caleb's new approach, Eliza spoke to him again. She'd been sitting on the fence as usual, and when Caleb arrived, she didn't leave. They watched Midnight in silence for 20 minutes before she said, "You're doing better." "Am I?" "You're not trying to break him anymore." "That's better." Caleb climbed up beside her, careful to leave space between them. Up close, he could see details he'd missed before. The careful darning on her sleeve, the calluses on her hands that said she did physical work, the way she kept her weight shifted to favor her good leg. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Why do you care what happens to this horse?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "Because nobody else does. My father sees him as a failed investment and a useful tool for humiliating people. The ranch hands see him as proof that some animals can't be saved. You saw him as a challenge to overcome." She paused. "I see him as something that's been hurt and doesn't know how to trust anymore. That feels familiar." The honesty in her voice cut through all the careful social distance Caleb had been maintaining. This wasn't small talk or polite conversation. This was truth. The limp, he said carefully. Were you born with it? No. Accident when I was 12. Fell off a horse, actually. Broke my leg badly, and the doctor did what he could, but she shrugged. It healed wrong. My father was furious, not because I was hurt, but because it made me unsuitable for the marriage market. Can't have a daughter who limps when you're trying to build alliances with important families. That's why he hides you. That's part of it. The rest is harder to explain without sounding like I'm looking for sympathy, which I'm not. She finally looked at him. Let's just say I don't fit the image he wants to project. So I stay out of sight, help where I'm useful, and try not to embarrass the family name. Caleb felt anger rising in his chest, not at her, but at the casual cruelty of a system that could discard someone for something so arbitrary. That's wrong, maybe, but it's reality. She turned back to Midnight. You want to know the real reason I watch this horse every morning? Because he reminds me that survival doesn't mean surrender. They've tried to break him, and he won't let them. There's something beautiful in that, even if it's also tragic. They sat in silence after that, watching the sun rise higher and burn off the morning mist. Midnight grazed, occasionally lifting his head to check on them, then going back to the grass. The ranch was waking up around them, sounds of men starting their day's work, the clang of tools, distant voices. You need to address the pain, Eliza said eventually. Before you can train him, you need to fix what's wrong with his body. How? There's a man 2 territories over, named Harrison Webb. He used to be a veterinary surgeon in Philadelphia before he moved west. Specialized in equine medicine. If anyone can help Midnight, it's him. Your father know about this man? Probably, but it would cost money and time, and admitting that the horse is salvageable. Easier to just write him off as impossible and use him as an obstacle for people who get too ambitious. She slid down from the fence. But you're not just using him as an obstacle anymore, are you? No. Caleb realized it was true as he said it. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, this had stopped being about winning a bet. I want to help him. Then get Webb out here. I'll cover the cost if you can't. You have money? A ghost of a smile crossed her face. My mother left me an inheritance before she died. Not much, but enough for this. My father controls it, technically, but there are ways around that if you're creative and stubborn. Caleb studied her face, seeing the steel underneath the quiet exterior. Why would you do that? Spend your money on a stranger's impossible project? Because it's not impossible. Not if it's done right. She met his eyes. And because I'm tired of watching things suffer when they don't have to. She left then, limping across the dusty yard toward the main house. Caleb watched her go, feeling like the ground had shifted underneath him in some fundamental way he didn't fully understand yet. That afternoon, he rode into Red Hollow and sent a telegram to Harrison Webb in Wyoming Territory. The veterinary surgeon's reply came 2 days later. He could arrive in 3 weeks, his fee would be $50 plus expenses, and he'd need at least a week to properly evaluate and treat the horse. Caleb had $17 to his name. He went to Eliza. She didn't ask questions, just handed him an envelope with $60 in it and said, "Pay me back when you can. Or don't. Either way, get that horse the help he needs." When Webb finally arrived, he was nothing like Caleb expected. Old, for one thing, at least 60, with white hair and hands that shook slightly from what might have been palsy or just age. But his eyes were sharp, and when he examined Midnight, those shaking hands moved with practiced precision. The diagnosis took 2 days and involved techniques Caleb had never seen, palpating muscles, watching movement patterns, even listening to Midnight's breathing and heartbeat with a strange tube-like instrument. The horse tolerated it better than Caleb expected, maybe because Webb moved with calm authority that didn't feel threatening. Muscle adhesions, Webb announced on the 3rd day, with Caleb, Garrett, and Eliza gathered around him. From the initial trauma to his leg and subsequent misuse. The leg itself healed, but the surrounding tissue didn't adapt properly. Every time he moves, it pulls on compensatory muscles in his back and shoulders. That creates pain, which creates tension, which creates a cycle he can't break. Can you fix it? Caleb asked. Fix? No. Improve? Probably. But it'll require massage therapy, controlled exercise, and time. At least 6 weeks of daily treatment before you'll see significant results. Caleb's heart sank. 6 weeks of treatment meant he'd have less than 4 weeks to actually train Midnight before the deadline. It wasn't enough time. Do it anyway, he said. Webb raised an eyebrow. You understand this likely means you'll lose your bet? I understand. Garrett looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Even Eliza seemed surprised, though she hit it better. Well then, Webb rolled up his sleeves. Let's get started. The treatment process was grueling. Webb taught Caleb massage techniques that looked gentle, but required specific pressure points and timing. They worked on midnight every morning and evening, slowly breaking up the adhesions and teaching the horse's body how to move properly again. It was painful for Midnight. Caleb could see it in the way the horse tensed, in the occasional grunt or shift. But Webb was patient, and gradually Midnight began to understand that this pain was different. It led somewhere. It got better. Eliza was there for most of it, watching and occasionally helping when Webb needed a third pair of hands. She had a way with Midnight that even Webb noticed, a stillness that seemed to calm the horse even during uncomfortable procedures. You've done this before, Webb said to her one evening. I've watched, and I read everything I could find about equine medicine after my own injury. Seemed important to understand how bodies work when they're damaged. Ever considered studying formally? You've got the mind for it. Eliza's laugh was bitter. Women don't become veterinary surgeons, Mr. Webb, especially not women with limps and no social prospects. The world's changing, might change faster than you think. Maybe, but not fast enough for me. Caleb listened to this exchange while working on Midnight's shoulder, his hands moving in the circular patterns Webb had taught him. He was starting to understand that Eliza's intelligence was both her greatest asset and her biggest liability in a world that didn't know what to do with smart women who couldn't be decorative. After 4 weeks of treatment, Midnight's transformation was visible. He moved with less stiffness, held his head at a more natural angle, and his temperament had shifted from constant aggression to wary neutrality. He still didn't trust humans. That would take longer. But he'd stopped seeing them as inevitable sources of pain. Time to start actual training, Webb said. Gentle leading work, getting him used to tack, building trust through consistency. Another man might be able to do it in the time you have left. You? He shrugged. We'll see. Caleb started with the basics. Just getting a halter on Midnight's head was a 3-day process. Leading him calmly took another week. Everything moved slower than it needed to because Caleb refused to force it, refused to create more trauma for the sake of meeting a deadline. The ranch hands started openly mocking him. Even the ones who'd been neutral before began making comments about wasted time and lost causes. Only Garrett remained quietly supportive, occasionally offering advice that Caleb actually found useful. You're doing it right, the old trainer said one evening. Slower than I'd like, and you probably won't make the deadline, but you're doing it right. It was the closest thing to approval Caleb had received from anyone except Eliza. With 5 weeks left, Caleb managed to get a saddle on Midnight's back. The horse spooked, reared, and threw it off 3 times before Caleb tried a different approach, letting Midnight smell it, investigate it, understand it wasn't a threat. On the 4th attempt, the saddle stayed on. With 4 weeks left, Caleb sat in the saddle for the first time, not riding, just sitting there while Midnight stood still and decided whether to accept this new weight. It took 40 minutes before the horse relaxed enough for Caleb to dismount without incident. Progress. Slow, painful progress. But not fast enough. Sheriff Creed visited the paddock with increasing frequency, always with that calculating smile, always making some comment about the approaching deadline. He brought Margaret twice, showing her the entertainment of watching Caleb's doomed effort. She watched with polite disinterest, then returned to the main house without speaking. The contrast with Eliza couldn't have been sharper. Eliza was there almost every day now, not just watching but actively helping, holding Midnight steady during difficult moments, suggesting approaches when Caleb hit obstacles, even working with the horse herself when Caleb was too exhausted to continue. They developed a rhythm, the 3 of them. Caleb would lead, Eliza would support, and Midnight would gradually, reluctantly, begin to trust. Why are you doing this? Caleb asked her one evening after a particularly difficult session. You're not getting anything out of it. Neither are you. Not anymore. The bet's already lost. That's different. How? He couldn't answer, because she was right. He'd stopped caring about Margaret, about winning, about proving anything to Sheriff Creed. Now he was doing it because Midnight deserved someone who'd put in the work, because walking away felt like betraying the horse, because Eliza believed it was possible, and disappointing her felt worse than failing the bet. When had that happened? With 3 weeks left, Caleb rode Midnight at a walk around the paddock. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't smooth, but it was riding. With 2 weeks left, they managed a trot. And with 1 week left, Caleb had to face reality. He wasn't going to make it. Midnight was responding well, showing trust and cooperation that would have seemed impossible 3 months ago. But responding well wasn't the same as fully trained. The horse was still skittish around sudden movements, still prone to spooking at unexpected sounds. Riding him into town square in front of a crowd would be asking for disaster. Caleb could try anyway, could hope for the best and risk undoing all the progress they'd made. Or he could admit defeat. He sat on the bunkhouse steps that night, turning the choice over in his mind. Either way, he lost. But one way harmed Midnight, and the other just harmed his pride. "You're thinking too hard." Eliza had appeared from the darkness, moving quietly despite her limp. She sat beside him on the steps without asking permission. "I'm thinking exactly hard enough," Caleb said. "Tomorrow's the deadline. I can't do it. Not without risking everything we've accomplished." "Then don't." "Just give up? Choose the horse over the bet." "That's not giving up. That's having priorities." She was quiet for a moment. "My father designed this to be impossible. He never expected you to succeed. The cruelty was the point. Watching you struggle, watching Midnight suffer, all of it feeding his sense of control. But you changed the game. You actually helped the horse. That's victory, even if it doesn't look like what you originally wanted." Caleb turned to look at her. In the lamplight from the bunkhouse, her face was serious, intelligent, and completely honest. No games, no manipulation, just truth. "What happens to you?" he asked. "After I lose and leave?" "Same thing that's always happened. I stay hidden, I stay useful, and I wait for, I don't know, something to change." "That's not enough. You deserve better than that." She smiled sadly. "Deserving has nothing to do with getting. You know that as well as I do." He did know it, had lived it his whole life. But sitting there beside her, he found himself wanting to argue, wanting to insist that things could be different, that people like them, the overlooked, the dismissed, the ones who didn't fit, deserved their chance. "Come with me," he said suddenly, "when I leave. Come with me." Eliza's eyes widened. "What?" "You've got money saved. I've got skills and a strong back. We could go somewhere new, start fresh. You could study medicine like you want to. I could, I don't know, work horses properly instead of just breaking them. We could build something that isn't about who your father is or what society expects." "You don't mean that." "I do." She stood up, and for a moment he thought she'd say yes, but then she shook her head. "You're scared and desperate, and you're grasping at anything that feels like winning, but running away with someone you barely know? That's not a plan. That's panic." "It's not panic. It's a fantasy. And I stopped believing in fantasies a long time ago." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Go to sleep, Caleb. Tomorrow you'll face whatever comes, and then you'll move on with your life. And I'll do the same with mine." She walked away before he could argue further, disappearing into the darkness. Caleb sat there until the lamplight died and the bunkhouse went quiet around him. Then he went to bed and stared at the ceiling until dawn, knowing that in a few hours, everything he'd worked for would publicly fall apart. He just hadn't realized how much worse it could get. The sun rose on Judgment Day with cruel clarity, burning off the morning fog and leaving nothing to hide behind. Caleb stood in the paddock with Midnight, running his hand along the horse's neck and feeling the steady rhythm of breathing beneath black hide. The horse was calm this morning, almost peaceful, and that made what was coming feel even worse. "We could still try," Garrett said from the fence. The old trainer had shown up an hour before dawn, apparently unable to sleep either. "Get him into town early, let him adjust to the noise before the crowd shows up. Might work. Might also undo 3 months of progress in 3 minutes." "So you're just going to forfeit? Walk away?" Caleb looked at Midnight, really looked at him, seeing not the challenge or the bet or the path to a better life, but just the animal himself. Stronger now than when they'd started, healthier, still carrying trauma, still learning to trust, but no longer that furious, pain-filled creature who'd attacked anything that moved. That was worth something. That mattered. "I'm going to tell Sheriff Creed I failed," Caleb said. "Then I'm going to ask if I can buy Midnight from him. Take the horse with me when I leave." "With what money?" "I'll figure something out. Garrett snorted, but there was approval in it. You're a damn fool, Vance, but you're an honest one. That counts for something. He pushed off from the fence. Come on, let's get this over with. The town square was already filling when they arrived on foot, Caleb having left Midnight safely in his paddock. Word had spread about the deadline, and apparently watching a drifter fail publicly was entertainment worth interrupting morning routines for. Merchants had opened their shops early. Women in their good dresses stood in clusters, pretending this was a social occasion. Men lined the boardwalks, some laughing, some making last-minute bets on exactly how the failure would play out. Sheriff Creed held court on the raised platform usually reserved for town meetings and occasional hangings. He stood with Margaret at his side. Both of them dressed like they were attending a wedding instead of a public humiliation. Catherine and Victoria were there too, looking bored and beautiful in equal measure. Eliza was nowhere to be seen. Caleb felt something twist in his chest at that absence. He'd hoped, what? That she'd be there to witness his defeat? That her presence would somehow make it easier? He didn't know. But her absence felt like abandonment, even though he had no right to expect anything from her. Mr. Vance! Creed's voice carried across the square, amplified by the morning air and the crowd's anticipation. Right on time. I do appreciate punctuality, even in doomed endeavors. Tell me, where's my horse? Where's this magnificent display of training you promised? The crowd laughed. Caleb walked toward the platform, feeling every eye on him, hearing the whispers and comments that people didn't bother keeping quiet. Poor bastard actually thought he could do it. 3 months wasted. Could have told him from the start. Sheriff played him like a fiddle. Porter Hayes stood near the front, his face still showing faint bruises from their fight 3 months ago. He was grinning like Christmas had come early. Caleb reached the platform and looked up at Sheriff Creed. The man's expression was triumphant, already savoring the victory that hadn't technically happened yet. Behind him, Margaret looked mildly curious, like she was watching a play she'd already seen but didn't mind experiencing again. I failed, Caleb said simply. No excuses, no explanations. Midnight's not ready to be ridden in public. Probably won't be for another few months, if ever. The crowd erupted. Laughter, jeers, a few sympathetic murmurs quickly drowned out by the majority's entertainment. Someone started clapping mockingly, and others picked it up until the square filled with the sound of derision. Creed held up his hand, and the noise gradually subsided. Well, I can't say I'm surprised, though I am disappointed. I had hoped you might at least provide us with a more dramatic failure, perhaps being thrown in front of everyone, or dragged around the square. This quiet admission is rather anticlimactic. More laughter. Caleb stood there and took it, keeping his face neutral, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. However, Creed continued, his smile widening, a bet is a bet. You failed to meet the terms of our agreement, which means you must leave Red Hollow. Today, preferably. I'm sure you understand. I do, but I have a request. Oh? You think you're in a position to make requests? I want to buy Midnight from you. I'll pay whatever you think is fair. Work it off if I don't have the cash now. But I want to take the horse with me. Creed's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. You want to buy the horse that just cost you everything? The horse you couldn't even train? Yes. Why in heaven's name would you do that? Because walking away and leaving Midnight here felt like betrayal. Because the horse deserved better than being a prop in Creed's power games. Because the only good thing to come out of this whole disaster was helping an animal that nobody else cared about. But Caleb didn't say any of that. He just repeated, I want to buy him. Creed studied him for a long moment, and Caleb could see the calculations happening behind those cold eyes. Then the sheriff smiled, and it was the worst smile yet, the one that said he'd just thought of something cruel. Tell you what, Vance, I'm feeling generous this morning, probably because I'm in such a good mood. I'll honor the spirit of our original bet, if not the letter of it. Caleb's stomach dropped. What does that mean? It means you did work with the horse. You did put in 3 months of effort, and while you failed to achieve the stated goal, I'm willing to acknowledge that you tried, so I'll give you a consolation prize. I don't want... You can marry one of my daughters. Creed's smile turned predatory. Not Margaret, of course. You didn't earn that. But I have another daughter who needs a husband, someone to take her off my hands, give her a home, Spare me the embarrassment of keeping her around. You take her, and I'll throw in the horse as a wedding gift. How's that for generosity?" The crowd went quiet. This wasn't the script anyone had expected. Caleb's mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. Catherine? Victoria? Neither of them had ever acknowledged his existence beyond brief glances. Why would Creed offer either of them to someone who just publicly failed? "I'll even bring her out here so you can meet your bride-to-be," Creed continued, gesturing to someone off stage. "After all, you should see what you're getting." A figure emerged from behind the platform, moving slowly, reluctantly. The crowd started murmuring, then gasping, then, worse, laughing. It was Eliza. She walked into the square wearing a dress that was clearly borrowed, too fancy for her and not quite the right size. Her hair had been done up in an elaborate style that didn't suit her, making her look like a child playing dress-up. And she was limping, not trying to hide it anymore, each step obviously painful, turning her approach into a spectacle. The laughter grew louder. Someone called out, "That's the prize? The crippled one?" Another voice, "Sheriff's clearing out his damaged goods." More laughter, cruel and casual, the kind that came from people who'd never been the target of public mockery and didn't understand what it cost. Eliza's face was pale, her jaw clenched tight, but she kept walking, kept moving toward the platform even though every step brought more humiliation. When she finally reached it, she didn't look at Caleb, didn't look at anyone, just stood there, trembling slightly, while the town laughed at her. "Well?" Creed asked, his voice carrying over the noise. "Do we have a deal? You take her, you get the horse, and everyone goes home happy. Refuse, and you leave with nothing. Your choice." It wasn't a choice. It was a public execution disguised as generosity. Caleb looked at Eliza's face, at the shame and anger and desperate dignity she was clinging to, and understood exactly what was happening. This was the real bet. Not the horse, not the training, but this moment right here. Creed had engineered the entire thing to create this exact scenario, offering his least valuable daughter to a failed drifter in front of the whole territory, turning both of them into jokes. If Caleb accepted, he'd be the man who settled for the consolation prize, forever marked as someone who couldn't achieve what he wanted and had to take what he could get. If he refused, Eliza would be the woman so undesirable that even a desperate nobody wouldn't have her. Either way, Creed won. The smart move was to refuse. Walk away, leave Red Hollow, start over somewhere else. He didn't owe Eliza anything. She'd helped with Midnight, sure, but that didn't obligate him to tie his entire future to hers, especially not in a marriage that would start as a public humiliation and probably never recover. Caleb opened his mouth to say no. Then he made the mistake of looking at Eliza's hands. They were clenched into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms hard enough to draw blood. She was holding herself together through pure force of will, refusing to break down in front of these people, refusing to give them the satisfaction, just like Midnight had refused to break, just like she'd recognized that quality in the horse because she lived it herself. And suddenly Caleb understood what Garrett had meant about choosing what mattered. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Eliza. The laughter intensified, people already assuming he was going to reject her, eager to see how she'd react. Instead, Caleb reached out and took her hand. The laughter faltered, confused. "Look at me," he said quietly, just for her. Eliza raised her head slowly, meeting his eyes for the first time since she'd entered the square. Her expression was devastated, humiliated, expecting the final blow. "I'm saying yes," Caleb told her, "not because of the horse, not because of the bet, because you're worth 10 of anyone else here, and I'm tired of watching good things get treated like they're worthless." Her eyes widened. "You don't have to." "I know. I'm choosing to." He turned to face the crowd, still holding her hand, and raised his voice. "Sheriff Creed offered me a deal. I accept. I'll marry Eliza, take the horse, and leave your town. And years from now, when you're all still here playing the same small-minded games, we'll be somewhere that actually matters." The square went dead silent. Sheriff Creed's smile had frozen on his face, stuck somewhere between triumph and confusion. He'd expected capitulation or rejection, not defiance. Not this. "Well then," Creed said slowly, recovering his composure, "I suppose congratulations are in order. We'll arrange the ceremony for—" "Today," Caleb interrupted. "Right now. Get whoever officiates weddings in this town, do it here in the square, and we'll be gone by sunset. That's highly irregular. You wanted to honor the bet. This honors it, unless you're backing out. It was a trap, and Creed knew it. He'd made the offer publicly, in front of witnesses. Backing out now would make him look like a liar and a cheat, and while he might be both those things, his power depended on maintaining the appearance of integrity. Fine, Creed said tightly. We'll do it today, but don't expect any celebration. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. Wouldn't dream of expecting anything else. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of arrangements that felt more like preparations for a funeral than a wedding. The town clerk was summoned to officiate. Papers were drawn up and signed. Eliza was taken back to the main house to change, not into a proper wedding dress, which would have been too much honor, but into something clean and presentable. Caleb waited in the stable, checking on midnight and trying to process what he'd just done. Married. He was getting married to a woman he barely knew in a town that hated both of them as the punchline to a cruel joke. "You've lost your mind," Garrett said, appearing in the stable doorway. "You know that, right?" "Probably. Could have just walked away, started fresh somewhere else. Now you're tied to her, tied to this humiliation, tied to everything?" "Yeah." Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then, "She's a good woman, smart, stronger than people give her credit for. You could do a lot worse." "I know." "You love her?" The question caught Caleb off guard. "I barely know her." "That's not what I asked." "No, I don't love her, but I respect her. And that seems like a better foundation than most marriages start with." "Maybe." Garrett pulled out his tobacco pouch, started rolling a cigarette. "Just don't expect it to be easy. Marriage never is, even without all this other mess tangled up in it." The ceremony happened at noon, in the same town square where Caleb had been publicly humiliated just hours before. Most of the crowd had dispersed, but enough remained to bear witness. Some out of genuine interest, most out of morbid curiosity. Eliza appeared wearing a simple blue dress that actually fit her properly, her hair pulled back in the practical style she usually wore. She looked nervous and angry and determined all at once, and when she walked toward Caleb this time, she met his eyes directly. "You can still change your mind," she said quietly when she reached him. "So can you." "I mean it. It's not fair to you. Fair stopped mattering a long time ago." The clerk cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" The ceremony was perfunctory, stripped of any romance or celebration. The clerk read the legal requirements in a monotone voice. Caleb and Eliza repeated the necessary words. Rings were exchanged, simple bands that Garrett had somehow procured on short notice. The whole thing took less than 10 minutes. "By the authority vested in me by the territory," the clerk droned, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. No, you may kiss the bride." No applause, just awkward silence, while everyone waited to see what would happen next. Caleb took Eliza's hand again. Her fingers were ice cold despite the warm day, and turned to face the remaining crowd. Sheriff Creed stood off to the side, his expression unreadable. Margaret looked bored. Catherine and Victoria had already left. "We'll be leaving now," Caleb announced. "Thank you for your hospitality." The sarcasm was thick enough to cut, but nobody called him on it. They just watched as he and Eliza walked across the square toward the stable, where Garrett had already loaded Caleb's pack horses and brought Midnight out. The black stallion was nervous. Too many people, too much noise. But Caleb approached slowly, speaking quietly, and the horse settled. Not completely calm, but manageable, trusting enough to let Caleb lead him. It took another hour to finish preparations. Eliza had 2 bags of belongings. Apparently everything she owned in the world fit into 2 canvas bags that had seen better days. Garrett donated some supplies, refusing payment. Mary the cook appeared with enough food for a week, also refusing payment, her eyes suspiciously bright. "You take care of each other," Mary said, hugging Eliza quickly. "And don't let anyone tell you this wasn't a real wedding. Legal's legal, and feelings catch up eventually if you're lucky." They left Red Hollow heading east toward Colorado territory. Caleb led Midnight, who was managing the journey better than expected. Eliza rode one of the pack horses, her bad leg making walking long distances impractical. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? They'd both just had their lives completely upended, and neither of them had fully processed it yet. As the sun started setting, Caleb found a decent camping spot near a creek with good grazing for the horses. He set up his bedroll, the only one he had, and started a fire while Eliza sat on a fallen log, watching him work. "You should take the bedroll," Caleb said when he noticed her watching. "I can sleep on a saddle blanket." "We're married," Eliza said flatly. "We're supposed to share. We don't have to. I wasn't expecting—" He stopped, feeling heat rise in his face. "I'm not going to force anything on you. This is a business arrangement, like your father said." "Is that what you think this is?" "Isn't it?" Eliza stood up, wincing as her bad leg protested. She walked over to where Caleb was kneeling by the fire and sat down beside him. "I want to understand something. Why did you really say yes? And don't give me that noble speech about me being worth 10 of everyone else. That was for the crowd. What's the real reason?" Caleb poked at the fire, watching sparks rise into the darkening sky. "Honestly, part of it was spite. I was angry at your father, angry at that whole town, and saying yes felt like spitting in their faces. Part of it was guilt. You'd helped me with Midnight, and leaving you there to deal with the aftermath alone felt wrong. And part of it—" He paused, trying to find the right words. "Part of it was recognition. You and me, we're the same kind of people, the ones who don't fit, who get overlooked or dismissed or used. And maybe I'm fooling myself, but I thought we might be able to build something together that we couldn't build alone. That's not love." "No, but it's honest." Eliza nodded slowly. "All right, here's my honest answer. I didn't want to marry you. I didn't want to marry anyone, especially not as part of some public humiliation my father orchestrated. But when you took my hand, when you chose me in front of everyone, you gave me something I haven't had since my accident, a choice. Not about whether to marry you, but about what happens next. So I'm choosing to try, to see if we can make this work, not as a business arrangement, but as actual partners." "Partners?" Caleb repeated. "I can work with partners." "Good. Then let's establish some rules." She held up one finger. "First, honesty. No polite lies, no pretending things are fine when they're not. We're stuck with each other now, so we might as well be straight about it." A second finger. "Second, respect. We don't have to love each other, but we treat each other like people who matter." A third finger. "Third, we figure out the rest as we go, and we're allowed to make mistakes as long as we're trying. Those are good rules." "I thought so." She stood up, brushing dust off her dress. "Now, about that bedroll. We're sharing it because we only have one and it's getting cold at night, but we're keeping our clothes on and staying on our respective sides. Agreed?" "Agreed." That night, lying beside someone who was legally his wife but effectively a stranger, Caleb stared up at the stars and wondered what the hell he'd gotten himself into. Beside him, Eliza was quiet, her breathing steady but not relaxed. Neither of them was sleeping. "Caleb?" she said eventually. "Yeah?" "Thank you for not leaving me there. Thank you for not running when you had the chance." A soft laugh in the darkness. "Where would I run to? You're stuck with me now. Same goes for you." They fell silent after that, but it was a less uncomfortable silence than before. Not companionable yet, but getting there. Maybe. The next few days established a routine. They traveled during the cooler morning and evening hours, rested during the heat of midday. Caleb handled the horses and navigation. Eliza managed their supplies and cooking with a practical efficiency that suggested she'd done it before. They talked sometimes about safe topics like where to find water, what route to take, whether the weather would hold. They didn't talk about the wedding or Red Hollow, or what they were going to do when they reached wherever they were going. On the fourth day, they encountered their first real problem. Caleb woke to find Eliza already up, sitting by the cold remains of last night's fire with her bad leg extended and her face tight with pain. "How long have you been awake?" he asked. "Couple hours. Couldn't sleep." "Your leg?" "It's fine." "Eliza, honesty, remember?" She closed her eyes briefly. "It hurts. Riding for days straight, sleeping on the ground. It's not good for it. But we need to keep moving, so I'm managing. We're stopping for a day. Give you time to rest." "We can't afford—" "Yes, we can. One day won't matter in the long run, and you can't help with anything if you're in too much pain to function." He expected her to argue, but instead she just nodded tiredly. "All right. One day. They spent that day camped by a small lake, letting the horses graze and rest. Eliza soaked her leg in the cold water, which seemed to help somewhat. Caleb caught fish for dinner, and they cooked it over the fire as the sun set. "Can I ask you something personal?" Caleb said while they ate. "You're my husband. Everything's personal now. What happened with your family? I mean, I know your father kept you hidden, but was it always that bad? After your accident?" Eliza was quiet for long enough that Caleb thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "It got worse gradually. At first, after the accident, everyone was sympathetic. My mother especially. She fought to make sure I got the best care, pushed the doctors to try different treatments. But when it became clear the limp was permanent, things changed. My father started talking about managing expectations and realistic prospects. My sisters got more attention, more resources, while I got relegated. What about your mother? You said she left you money." "She died when I was 16. Fever. After that, there was nobody advocating for me anymore. My father made it clear I was an embarrassment he had to tolerate. So I learned to be useful in ways that didn't require social visibility. I helped with the horses, managed some of the household accounts, read everything I could get my hands on, made myself valuable enough to keep around but not visible enough to cause problems. That's a hell of a way to live." "It was survival. Same as you've done, I imagine. Different circumstances. Same principle." She was right. Caleb had spent his whole life making himself useful enough to keep, never staying long enough to be a burden, always moving before people could decide he wasn't worth the trouble. They'd both learned the same lessons, just in different contexts. "We should be different," he said. "Better than that. Should be is a long way from will be. Then we'll figure it out as we go." That was rule 3, right? A faint smile crossed her face. "Right." They reached Colorado territory 2 weeks after leaving Red Hollow, settling temporarily in a small town called Silverton that was trying to grow into something bigger than its current collection of buildings suggested. Caleb found work at a local ranch that was expanding its horse operation. It didn't pay much, but it came with a small cabin on the property that he and Eliza could live in while they figured out their next move. The cabin was basic. 1 room, a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a bed that was barely big enough for 1 person, let alone 2. They managed by taking turns sleeping, 1 on the bed and 1 in a bedroll on the floor, switching off each night. It wasn't ideal, but it worked. Eliza found work too, helping at the general store. The owner's wife was getting on in years and needed assistance with inventory and bookkeeping. When she discovered Eliza could read, write, and calculate faster than most educated men, she doubled the offered wage on the spot. They fell into a new routine: work during the day, home for dinner, quiet evenings by lamplight. Caleb would work on leather repairs or read. Eliza would mend clothes or write letters to Harrison Webb, asking detailed questions about equine medicine that the old veterinarian seemed happy to answer. They were civil to each other, polite. They followed the rules they'd established: honesty, respect, figuring things out as they went. But there was no warmth between them, no intimacy beyond the practical necessities of sharing space. They were roommates who happened to be legally married, nothing more. And that was fine. That was the agreement, partnership without pretense. Except Caleb kept noticing things. The way Eliza's face lit up when she talked about horses or medicine, intelligence sparking in her eyes like fire. The quiet competence with which she managed their limited resources, making $3 stretch further than he'd thought possible. The gentleness she showed midnight whenever she had time to visit him, speaking softly and moving carefully, earning trust the same way Caleb had learned to do. She was remarkable. Anyone with eyes could see it. The problem was, he was starting to feel things that went beyond recognition, things that hadn't been part of the deal. 3 months into their marriage, on a night when Caleb was supposed to be sleeping on the floor but couldn't seem to settle, Eliza spoke from the bed. "I know you're awake." "Sorry, didn't mean to keep you up." "You didn't. I was awake too." A pause. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Do you regret it? Marrying me?" Caleb sat up, looking toward the bed even though the darkness made it impossible to see her clearly. "No. Why would you think that?" "Because we're living in a 1-room cabin, barely making enough to survive. Because you're sleeping on the floor. Because this clearly isn't the future you imagined when you made that bet with my father." "The future I imagined doesn't matter anymore. This is the future I've got, and it's not bad. It's not good either. It's not finished yet. We're still building it." Silence. Then quietly, Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you'd said no, if you'd walked away and left me in Red Hollow. You would have survived. You're too stubborn not to. Maybe, but I wouldn't have had this. A chance to be something other than the daughter nobody wanted. Caleb stood up, crossed the small room to the bed. He sat on the edge carefully, giving her space to move away if she wanted. She didn't. You were never the daughter nobody wanted, he said. You were the daughter one bastard didn't deserve. There's a difference. In the darkness, he felt more than saw her reach for his hand. Her fingers were warm this time, not cold like they'd been at the wedding. I'm glad you said yes, she whispered. Even though it's hard, even though we don't know what we're doing, I'm glad. Me too. Something shifted between them in that moment, subtle but unmistakable. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it, the recognition that what they were building might become something neither of them had expected. Caleb went back to his bedroll on the floor, but he slept better that night than he had in months. The possibility was enough, but possibility wasn't the same as certainty, and the next 6 months taught them both the difference. Winter came early to Colorado Territory that year, dumping snow by the foot and turning their small cabin into a test of endurance. The wood stove barely kept the cold at bay, and there were mornings when Caleb woke to frost on the inside of the windows and his breath visible in the air. They huddled close to the stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned, and pretended the situation was temporary. It wasn't. Money was tighter than Caleb had anticipated. The ranch work paid, but barely enough to cover food and necessities. Eliza's job at the general store helped, but she'd been forced to cut her hours when her leg worsened in the cold. The old injury aching constantly, sometimes badly enough that she couldn't stand for more than a few minutes at a time. They didn't talk about how much they were struggling. That would have meant admitting defeat, and neither of them was ready for that. Instead, they fought about small things. You bought tobacco? Eliza's voice was sharp when she found the pouch in Caleb's coat pocket. We can barely afford flour, and you're spending money on tobacco? It was 20 cents, and I haven't bought any in 2 months. 20 cents is 2 meals, or candles, or I know what 20 cents buys, Eliza. I'm the one who earns most of it. The words came out harsher than he'd intended, and he saw her flinch. The silence that followed was heavy, full of things neither of them wanted to say. You're right, she said finally, her voice flat. It's your money. Spend it however you want. She turned away before he could apologize, limping to the other side of their tiny cabin and sitting on the bed with her back to him. Caleb stood there, feeling like garbage, the tobacco pouch heavy in his hand. He threw it in the stove that night, watched it burn. It didn't fix anything. The fights became more frequent as winter wore on. Stupid fights about nothing, who used the last of the coffee, whose turn it was to haul water, whether they could afford lamp oil or should just go to bed when the sun set. They were both exhausted, both scared, both trying to hold together something that felt like it was unraveling faster than they could repair it. And underneath all of it was the thing they never discussed. They were strangers living as husband and wife, trying to build intimacy from scratch in conditions that would have tested couples who'd known each other for years. This isn't working, Eliza said one night in early February. They'd just had another fight, this time about whether to spend their last few dollars on medicine for her leg or grain for the horses. Caleb had insisted on the medicine. Eliza had called him condescending for making decisions about her own body. It had escalated from there. Now they sat on opposite sides of the cabin, the stove burning between them like a demarcation line. What do you want me to say? Caleb asked tiredly. I want you to be honest. This marriage, it's not what either of us wanted. We're trying to make something work that maybe can't work, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise. So what? You want to leave? I'm saying maybe we should admit we made a mistake, that getting married to spite my father and save face wasn't actually a good foundation for a life together. Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest. Where would you go? I don't know. But I can't keep doing this, living in one room, fighting over scraps, watching you resent me a little more every day. I don't resent you. Yes, you do. Maybe you don't mean to, but you do. I see it in your face when you think I'm not looking. You're thinking about what you gave up, the life you could have had if you just walked away instead of playing hero. She wasn't entirely wrong, and that made it worse. There were moments, usually late at night when he couldn't sleep and the cabin walls felt like a cage, when Caleb did think about the alternate path. What if he'd refused Creed's offer? What if he'd left Red Hollow alone, found work somewhere else, started fresh without being tied to a wife he barely knew? But those thoughts always circled back to the same place. Eliza standing in that town square, trembling and humiliated, while everyone laughed, and him walking away, leaving her to face it alone. He couldn't have done it. Not then, and not now. "I don't regret marrying you," he said quietly. "But I do regret that we're struggling like this, that I can't provide better, that you're in pain and I can't fix it, that everything is harder than it should be." "Life is hard. That's not your fault." "Then whose fault is it?" "Nobody's. That's the point. We're both doing our best and it's still not enough, and blaming each other doesn't change that." They sat in silence, the truth of her words settling over them like the cold that seeped through every crack in the cabin walls. "So what do we do?" Caleb asked. "I don't know. But something has to change." The change came from an unexpected source. A week later, a man named Robert Chen showed up at the ranch where Caleb worked. He was Chinese, middle-aged, dressed well enough to suggest money, but practically enough to suggest he knew how to work. He introduced himself as the owner of a horse farm 2 territories over, and he'd heard about Caleb's work with Midnight. "Garrett wrote to me," Chen explained when Caleb looked confused. "The old trainer from Red Hollow. Said you did something remarkable with an untrainable horse. Said you had patience and skill that most men lack." "Garrett said that?" "He did. Also said you're struggling financially and might be interested in a proposal." They talked for 2 hours. Chen's operation was larger than anything Caleb had imagined. 100 acres of good land, dedicated facilities for training and rehabilitation, clients from across 3 territories who paid premium prices for horses that were properly trained rather than just broken. He'd built it over 20 years through reputation and results. "I need someone who can work with difficult animals," Chen said. "Horses that other trainers have given up on. The work is hard, but it pays well. Room and board for you and your wife, plus a salary that would let you save money instead of just surviving." "Why me? You don't know me." "I know Garrett. He doesn't give recommendations lightly, and I know what it takes to work with broken things: patience, empathy, willingness to fail and try again. You have those qualities. Most men don't." Caleb wanted to say yes immediately. This was exactly the kind of opportunity he'd been hoping for. Meaningful work, decent pay, a chance to build something real, but he couldn't make the decision alone anymore. "I need to talk to my wife," he said. Chen nodded. "Of course. I'm staying in town for 3 days. Let me know." Caleb found Eliza at the general store, helping an elderly woman select fabric. She looked tired. Her leg was clearly bothering her today, but she smiled when she saw him, a real smile that reminded him of those early morning conversations at the paddock fence back in Red Hollow. "Can you take a break?" he asked. "Give me 5 minutes." They walked to a small park near the center of town. Bare trees and dead grass, but at least some privacy. Caleb explained Chen's offer, watching Eliza's face carefully for her reaction. 2 territories away," she said when he finished. "That's far." "It's far from here. But it's not like we've got roots in Silverton." "No. But it's another move. Another place where we don't know anyone, where we have to start over. With better circumstances this time. Real work, real pay. A chance to actually build something instead of just scraping by." Eliza was quiet, and Caleb could see her thinking through the angles, weighing options the way she always did. She'd gotten better over the months at letting him see her process instead of hiding it. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "I want to take it, but only if you're willing. This affects both of us." "You're asking my permission?" "I'm asking your opinion. There's a difference." A faint smile crossed her face. "All right, my opinion is that we should go. You're wasted doing basic ranch work here. This is the kind of opportunity that could actually lead somewhere. And," she hesitated, "and I think we need a fresh start, somewhere that isn't full of reminders of how badly we've been struggling." Relief flooded through Caleb. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." "When do we leave?" They packed everything they owned, which wasn't much, and headed west with Robert Chen a week later. The journey took 5 days through mountain passes still clogged with snow, but when they finally arrived at Chen's property, Caleb understood why Garrett had recommended this place. The ranch was pristine, well-maintained buildings, good fencing, horses in the paddocks that looked healthy and alert. There was a main house where Chen lived with his wife and 2 daughters, plus 3 smaller cottages for employees. The work facilities included a covered training arena, multiple paddocks of varying sizes, and a barn that was better equipped than some homes Caleb had lived in. "You'll stay in this one," Chen said, showing them to the westernmost cottage. It was small, but weather-tight, with 2 rooms instead of 1, a real bed, a stove that actually worked, and windows that didn't let in drafts. After the cabin in Silverton, it looked like luxury. Eliza walked through the space slowly, touching the walls, testing the stove, examining everything with careful attention. When she turned to look at Caleb, her eyes were bright. "This is good," she said simply. The work started the next day. Chen introduced Caleb to the current project, a mare that had been abused by her previous owner and now kicked at anyone who approached her stall. She was valuable breeding stock, which was why Chen had purchased her, but useless if she couldn't be handled safely. "Take your time," Chen said. "I'd rather have her properly rehabilitated in 6 months than poorly managed in 6 weeks. It was the opposite of everything Caleb had experienced at Red Hollow, and he felt something in his chest loosen. This was work he could do, work that mattered. Eliza found her place too. Chen's wife, May, needed help managing the household accounts and ordering supplies for the operation. When she discovered Eliza's facility with numbers and organization, she offered to teach her more advanced bookkeeping. "My daughters aren't interested in the business side," May explained, "but someone will need to manage it when Robert and I get older. If you're willing to learn, I'm willing to teach." For the first time since leaving Red Hollow, they weren't just surviving, they were building. The change in their relationship was gradual but unmistakable. Without the constant pressure of poverty and struggle, they had space to actually learn about each other. They started having conversations that went beyond logistics and conflict. Real conversations about ideas, experiences, the things that had shaped them before they met. "I wanted to be a teacher," Eliza said one night. They were sitting outside their cottage, watching the sun set over the mountains. Before the accident, "I loved reading, loved learning, thought maybe I could help other people do the same." "You still could. Nothing's stopping you from teaching." "Except I barely finished my own education. My father saw no point in wasting money on lessons for a daughter who wouldn't make an advantageous marriage. So teach yourself. You're already doing it with the horse medicine, reading everything you can find, writing to Webb with questions. Apply the same approach to teaching." She looked at him, surprised. "You think I could?" "I think you're smarter than half the so-called educated people I've met. The only difference is they had opportunities and you didn't. But opportunities can be made if you're stubborn enough." Over the following weeks, Eliza started collecting books, borrowing them from May, ordering them through the general store in the nearest town, even writing to educational institutions to request course catalogs and curriculum guides. She studied at night by lamplight, taking notes in careful handwriting, building knowledge the same way they were building their life, piece by piece, with patience and determination. Caleb watched her transform. Not in appearance, she still wore practical dresses and pulled her hair back in simple styles, but in confidence. She moved through the world differently now, like someone who'd remembered she was allowed to take up space. And he found himself falling. It wasn't dramatic. No thunderbolt moment, no sudden realization, just a slow accumulation of small things, the way she laughed at herself when she made mistakes, the intensity of her focus when she was working through a problem, the gentleness she showed animals and people alike. The scar tissue from her accident that she'd been taught to hide, but that he'd learned to see as evidence of survival rather than damage. He was falling in love with his wife, and he had no idea how to tell her. The problem was that their marriage had started as a business arrangement. They'd agreed to partnership without pretense, and changing that agreement unilaterally felt like breaking the rules. What if she didn't feel the same way? What if telling her made everything awkward and ruined what they'd built? So he kept quiet and tried to show it in other ways. He fixed things around the cottage before she asked. He brought her coffee in the morning, made exactly how she liked it. He listened when she talked about her studies and asked questions that showed he cared about her answers, not just about being polite. If she noticed, she didn't say anything. Spring came, and with it, new challenges. The mare Caleb had been working with made breakthrough progress, eventually allowing him to ride her without incident. Chen was thrilled, and immediately brought 3 more difficult horses for rehabilitation. The workload increased, but so did Caleb's reputation. Other ranchers started asking Chen who was doing his training work, and Chen gave Caleb full credit. "You have a gift," Chen told him one evening. "Not just skill, but genuine empathy for these animals. That's rare and valuable." Eliza's work expanded too. She'd proven so capable with the accounts that May started teaching her about breeding lines, bloodline documentation, and the business strategy that made the operation profitable. The older woman treated her like the daughter she'd wished for, someone actually interested in learning the trade rather than just waiting to marry out of it. "You could run this place someday," May said. "Not tomorrow, not next year, but eventually, if you wanted to." "I'm not family," Eliza said carefully. "Family is who shows up and does the work. Blood is just biology." That night, lying in their actual bed in their actual room, Eliza told Caleb about the conversation. "She offered me something I didn't think I could have," she said quietly. "A future that's about what I can do, not what I look like or how I walk. That matters to me more than I know how to explain." "You don't have to explain, I understand." "Do you? Because sometimes I worry that you're just being polite. That you agreed to this marriage out of pity or obligation, and you're still just tolerating me instead of actually wanting me here." Caleb rolled over to face her. They were closer than usual in the bed, not touching, but close enough that he could see her face clearly in the moonlight coming through the window. "I don't tolerate you, Eliza. He stopped, searching for words that wouldn't sound like empty promises. "When we got married, I thought I was doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. Spite, guilt, stubbornness. But somewhere along the way, those reasons changed, became something real. And now when I think about my life, I can't imagine it without you in it. Not because I'm obligated to keep you, but because I don't want to lose you." She was very still. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you. I don't know when it happened or how, but it did. And I know that wasn't part of our agreement, so if you don't feel the same way, we can just—" She kissed him. It was tentative at first, uncertain, like she was testing whether this was real or just another misunderstanding. But when Caleb kissed her back, gentle and sure, something shifted. The distance they'd been maintaining disappeared. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Eliza rested her forehead against his. "I've loved you for months," she whispered. "I just didn't think I was allowed to." "Why not?" "Because you married me out of necessity, not choice. Because I was the consolation prize, not what you actually wanted. Because I thought if I let myself feel this way, I'd get hurt when you eventually realized you'd settled for less than you deserved." Caleb cupped her face in his hands, making her look at him. "You're not a consolation prize. You're the best decision I ever made, even when I was making it for stupid reasons. You're smart, strong, kind, and you make me want to be better than I am. That's not settling, that's winning." "You really mean that?" "Every word." She kissed him again, and this time there was no hesitation. This time it was certain. They made love that night for the first time since their wedding, and it was nothing like either of them had imagined. Awkward in places, tender in others, full of whispered questions and nervous laughter, and the strange intimacy of learning someone's body for the first time. Eliza's scars, the ones on her leg from the accident, the ones on her heart from years of rejection, were laid bare, and Caleb treated them all with the same gentle attention he'd learned to show frightened horses. Afterward, wrapped together in the darkness, Eliza said, "I never thought I'd have this. Someone who chose me. Someone who stayed. I'm not going anywhere. Promise?" "Promise." It was a turning point, but not the end of their challenges. Love didn't magically solve their problems or erase their differences. They still fought sometimes, about money, about whose approach was right for a particular situation, about stupid things that didn't really matter. But now those fights were tempered by the knowledge that they were on the same side, that they'd chosen each other, genuinely and completely. Summer brought prosperity. Chen's operation grew as word spread about Caleb's work with difficult horses. Wealthy ranchers from across 3 territories started sending their problem animals to the farm, willing to pay premium prices for proper rehabilitation. Caleb hired 2 assistants to help with the volume, teaching them the techniques he'd learned through trial and error and Eliza's insights. Eliza's role expanded too. She wasn't just managing accounts anymore, she was helping with strategic decisions, evaluating which horses to purchase for breeding, even consulting on difficult training cases when Caleb hit obstacles. May had been right. She could run this place someday. And maybe she would. "I've been thinking," Caleb said one evening in late August. They were sitting on their cottage porch, watching midnight graze in the nearby paddock. The horse was healthy now, truly healthy, moving without pain or hesitation. He'd become something of a mascot for the operation, proof that even the most damaged animals could heal if given proper care. "About what?" Eliza asked. Eliza titsed. "Starting our own place. Not now, not tomorrow, but eventually. Using what we're learning here to build something that's ours." "What kind of place?" "A ranch for horses that nobody else wants. The ones with injuries, trauma, behavioral problems. The ones that get discarded because they're not worth the effort. We could rehabilitate them, train them properly, find them good homes, create something that matters." Eliza was quiet, but he could see her mind working. "That would take years to establish, and significant capital." "I know, but we've got time, and we're good at building from nothing. We've done it before." "We have." She reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "All right, let's build something." It became their shared dream, the thing they worked toward together. They saved every dollar they could spare. They read everything available about ranch management and horse rehabilitation. They built relationships with suppliers, veterinarians, other ranchers. They planned obsessively, adjusting their vision based on what they learned, but never losing sight of the core goal. And somewhere in all of that planning and working and building, they became something neither of them had expected. A partnership based not on necessity or obligation, but on genuine love and mutual respect. 2 years after arriving at Chen's ranch, Eliza discovered she was pregnant. The news hit Caleb like a physical blow. Not bad, just overwhelming. They'd been careful, trying to wait until they were more established. But nature had its own timeline. "Are you angry?" Eliza asked, watching his face. "No. Terrified, but not angry. You?" "Same. I have no idea how to be a mother. My own mother died when I was 16, and my father certainly wasn't a model parent. What if I'm terrible at it? Then we'll be terrible at it together and figure it out as we go. Same as everything else." She laughed, slightly hysterical. "That's a terrible plan. It's the only plan we've got." The pregnancy was difficult. Eliza's damaged leg made carrying extra weight painful, and she developed complications in her third trimester that required bed rest. Caleb cut back his work hours to care for her, and May helped by bringing meals and sitting with Eliza when Caleb had to be at the training facilities. "You're scared," May observed one afternoon, watching Caleb pace outside the cottage. "Of course I'm scared. What if something goes wrong? What if she gets hurt? What if you drive yourself mad with worry and it changes nothing?" May interrupted gently. "She's strong, Caleb. Stronger than you give her credit for. And she has good care. Trust that." The baby came early on a cold March morning, 3 weeks before the expected date. The labor was long and hard, and there were moments when Caleb genuinely thought he might lose both of them. But Eliza fought through it with the same stubborn determination she applied to everything, and when the midwife finally placed a tiny, screaming infant in her arms, Caleb felt something in his chest crack open. "It's a boy," the midwife said, smiling. Eliza looked exhausted, pale, and more beautiful than Caleb had ever seen her. "We have a son," she said wonderingly. They named him Thomas after Eliza's grandfather, the one person in her family who'd treated her with consistent kindness before he died. Tommy for short. Fatherhood changed Caleb in ways he didn't fully understand. The fear he'd felt during Eliza's pregnancy didn't disappear. If anything, it intensified. Now he had 2 people depending on him, 2 lives that would be affected by every decision he made. The weight of that responsibility was crushing sometimes, but it was also clarifying. Every plan they'd made for their future ranch now had additional purpose. They weren't just building something for themselves anymore. They were building it for Tommy. Creating a place where he could grow up understanding that worth came from character, not from social standing or physical perfection, where damaged things could heal, where being different wasn't a liability. "He's going to have the better childhood than either of us had," Eliza said one night, watching Caleb hold their sleeping son. "He is. We'll make sure of it. No pressure, though. None at all." They smiled at each other across the lamplight, partners in the most important project they'd ever undertaken. 6 months later, Chen made them an offer. "I'm getting old," he said bluntly, "and my daughters have no interest in taking over the operation. I want to sell the ranch, but not to just anyone. I want it to go to people who will maintain what May and I built. People who understand that this is about more than profit." "You're offering to sell it to us?" Caleb asked, stunned. "At a fair price, with terms you can manage. You'd take over the operation, keep the staff, continue the work. In 5 years, maybe 10, you could expand, buy additional land, grow the rehabilitation program you've been planning, build it into something even bigger than what we started." It was everything they dreamed about, handed to them years earlier than expected. It was also terrifying. "We need to think about it," Eliza said carefully. "Of course. Take your time, but not too much time. I'd like to retire before I'm too old to enjoy it." That night, after Tommy was asleep, Caleb and Eliza sat at their small kitchen table and faced the question that would determine their future. "Can we do this?" Eliza asked. "I don't know. It's a huge responsibility. Employees depending on us, clients expecting results, a whole operation to manage." "That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking if you think we're ready." Caleb looked at his wife, this woman who'd been hidden away like an embarrassment, who'd taught herself medicine and business through sheer determination, who'd given birth to their son despite complications that would have broken other people. She'd been ready for this her whole life. The only question was whether he was. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think we're ready. Scared, but ready." "Then let's do it." They told Chen yes the next morning, and within 3 months, the paperwork was complete. The ranch that had been Chen's life work became theirs, not through inheritance or gift, but through honest purchase and genuine trust. Standing on the porch of what was now their house, looking out over land that now belonged to them, Caleb felt the same vertigo he'd experienced in Red Hollow's town square 3 years ago. Except this time, it wasn't from humiliation. It was from realizing how far they'd come from that moment when Eliza had walked toward him, trembling and humiliated, while a town laughed. Now they owned a ranch, employed a dozen people, had built a reputation for honest work and quality results, had a son sleeping peacefully in the nursery, had each other, chosen freely and loved completely. "What are you thinking?" Eliza asked, appearing beside him with Tommy in her arms. "That your father would hate this. Us succeeding, being happy, building something real." "Good. Let him hate it." She smiled fiercely. "We didn't do this for him or despite him. We did it for us. And that's what makes it matter." She was right. Creed's opinion, anyone's opinion, was irrelevant now. This was their life, built on their terms, and nobody could take it from them. Caleb kissed his wife and his son, then went back to work. There were horses to train, employees to manage, a future to build, and he couldn't wait to get started. The years that followed weren't easy, but they were honest. Running the ranch meant 14-hour days during peak season, budget meetings that stretched past midnight, difficult decisions about which horses to take on and which to turn away. It meant dealing with clients who thought they knew better, employees who occasionally needed discipline, and the constant pressure of keeping a business profitable while maintaining their principles. Caleb learned that owning something was harder than working for someone else. When you were just an employee, you could leave problems at the end of your shift. When it was your ranch, your reputation, your family's livelihood, problems followed you home and kept you awake at night. "We're taking on too many difficult cases," he told Eliza one evening, reviewing their accounts. "The rehabilitation work pays eventually, but it ties up resources for months. We need more quick turnaround training to keep cash flow steady." "So we compromise our mission for profit?" Eliza asked. She was nursing their second child, a daughter they'd named Sarah, while simultaneously checking inventory lists. Motherhood hadn't slowed her down. If anything, it had sharpened her efficiency. "I'm not saying compromise, I'm saying balance. We can't help anyone if we go bankrupt." "We're not going bankrupt. We're just not accumulating wealth as fast as we could if we only took easy cases." "That's a comfortable position when you're not the one worrying about making payroll." Eliza looked up sharply. "Excuse me? I manage the entire financial operation of this ranch. I know exactly what payroll costs, what our margins are, and what risks we can afford to take. Don't condescend to me about money." They stared at each other across the kitchen table, the old familiar tension rising between them. Marriage and love hadn't erased their capacity for conflict, It had just changed the context. Caleb rubbed his face tiredly. You're right. I'm sorry. I'm just stressed about the Dalton horse. The Dalton horse was their current nightmare, a thoroughbred with severe trust issues and a propensity for violence that made Midnight look gentle by comparison. They'd been working with him for 2 months with minimal progress, and the owner was getting impatient. We could send him back, Eliza suggested. Tell Dalton we can't help him, and let that horse get destroyed, because that's what'll happen. Dalton already told me if we can't fix him, he's putting him down as too dangerous to keep. That's not your responsibility, Caleb. You can't save every horse. I know, but I have to try. It was an old argument, one they'd had in various forms over the years. Caleb's tendency to take on impossible cases, Eliza's practical concern about sustainability. Neither was wrong, but they approached problems from different angles, and that friction created heat. Eventually, they'd find compromise, the way they always did. But the process was exhausting. Tommy wandered into the kitchen then, 4 years old and curious about everything. Why are you fighting? We're not fighting, Eliza said automatically. We're discussing. Loud discussing, Tommy observed. Caleb laughed despite himself. Yeah, buddy. Sometimes discussions get loud. That's okay. It means we both care about getting the right answer. What's the right answer? We're still figuring that out. Tommy seemed satisfied with that explanation and went back to playing with his wooden horses. Caleb watched him go, thinking about the lessons they were teaching without meaning to. That disagreement didn't mean disaster, that you could argue and still love someone, that finding answers took work, and work was worth doing. They kept the Dalton horse and eventually made breakthrough progress through a technique Eliza had read about in one of Harrison Webb's letters, approaching training through positive reinforcement rather than correction. It took 4 months instead of 2, cost them more than they made on the contract, but the horse survived and eventually thrived. Caleb considered that a victory, even if the spreadsheets disagreed. Their reputation grew steadily. People throughout the territory knew that if you had a horse nobody else could handle, the Vance Ranch would at least try. They didn't always succeed. Some animals were too damaged, too far gone, too dangerous. But they tried honestly, and that meant something. Word spread in other ways too. Ranch hands who'd been dismissed from other jobs for being too old, too inexperienced, or too different found work at the Vance Ranch. Eliza had a talent for seeing potential in people that others missed, the same way she'd seen it in Midnight all those years ago. You hired another one, Caleb said when he met their newest employee, a young man named Marcus who'd lost his left hand in a farming accident and couldn't find work anywhere else. He can ride better one-handed than most men can with 2, Eliza replied, and he needs the job. We're not a charity. No, we're a place that understands being underestimated. There's a difference. Marcus became one of their best trainers, developing techniques specifically adapted for his limitation that ended up being useful for everyone. Caleb never mentioned charity again. 5 years into owning the ranch, they received a letter that changed everything. It came from Red Hollow, forwarded through 3 different addresses before finally reaching them. The handwriting was shaky but legible, and the signature at the bottom read, Garrett. The old horse trainer was dying. Cancer, he wrote. Nothing to be done about it at his age. He had maybe 6 months left, and he wanted to see Caleb one more time before the end. Also wanted to tell him something important that couldn't be put in a letter. You should go, Eliza said after reading it. I can't just leave the ranch for... Yes, you can. I can manage things here for a week or 2, and you'd regret it if you didn't go. She was right, though Caleb hated admitting it. Garrett had been the one constant source of support in Red Hollow, the one person besides Eliza who treated him with genuine respect. He owed the old man a final visit. The journey back to Red Hollow took 6 days, and with each mile, Caleb felt old memories rising like ghosts. He'd left this place 7 years ago, humiliated and angry, married to a woman he barely knew, with nothing but a damaged horse and wounded pride. Now he was returning as someone completely different. Successful ranch owner, husband, father, respected trainer. The transformation should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt strange and slightly sad. Red Hollow itself hadn't changed much. Same buildings, same streets, same self-important atmosphere. But something felt smaller about it, like returning to a childhood home and discovering it wasn't as grand as memory suggested. Garrett lived in a small house on the edge of town, maintained by a niece who greeted Caleb at the door with tired eyes. He's been waiting for you, she said. Talks about you sometimes. About that horse you trained. I think it mattered to him more than he let on. The old trainer was exactly that. Old. 7 years had aged him 20, illness carving away everything except stubbornness and bone. But his eyes were still sharp when Caleb entered the room. You came, Garrett said, his voice rough. Of course I came. Wasn't sure you would. Figured you might be too busy being successful to bother with a dying old man. Don't be dramatic. It doesn't suit you. Garrett laughed, which turned into coughing. When he recovered, he gestured for Caleb to sit. Tell me about the ranch, about Eliza, about everything. So Caleb did. He talked for an hour, describing the work they were doing, the employees they'd hired, the children who were growing up surrounded by horses and honest labor. He talked about the struggles too, the financial pressures, the difficult cases, the constant balancing act between idealism and survival. Garrett listened to all of it with obvious satisfaction. You did good, Vance. Better than good. You built something that matters. We built it, Eliza and me together. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. Garrett shifted in his bed, wincing. You know why I wrote to Robert Chen all those years ago? Why I recommended you? You said I had potential. That's part of it. But the real reason was Eliza. I saw what she was doing with Midnight, saw how she understood that horse better than anyone. And I saw how you started listening to her, learning from her, treating her like someone who mattered. Most men wouldn't have done that. Hell, most men didn't even see her, but you did. Caleb remembered those early morning conversations at the paddock fence, Eliza teaching him patience while everyone else watched and waited for him to fail. She saved Midnight, Caleb said, and probably saved me too. That's why I helped, because I figured if you were smart enough to recognize her value, you might actually make something of yourself. And I was right. Garrett paused, gathering strength. Sheriff Creed died 2 years ago. Heart attack. Sudden, they said, but I think he'd been sick for a while and too proud to admit it. The news hit Caleb harder than expected. He'd spent years imagining Creed getting what he deserved, facing some kind of karmic justice for his cruelty. But a heart attack? That was just biology. Random and meaningless. What about his daughters? Caleb asked. Margaret married some banker from St. Louis. Lives there now, from what I hear. Catherine runs the ranch, does a decent job of it too, better than her father in some ways. Victoria married into politics, spends most of her time in the territorial capital. Garrett's expression shifted. They ask about Eliza sometimes, whether she's alive, whether she's all right. I think they regret how they treated her, though they'd never admit it. They should regret it. Maybe. Or maybe they were just young and doing what they were taught. Your kids ever do something cruel because they didn't know better? Caleb thought about Tommy accidentally breaking Sarah's favorite toy, about the fights and tears that followed, about teaching them to apologize and mean it. Yeah, they do. Exactly. People are complicated, even the ones who hurt us. They talked until Garrett tired, which happened quickly now. Caleb promised to visit again before leaving town, then walked out into the red hollow evening, feeling unsettled. He found himself drawn to the Creed Ranch without consciously deciding to go there. The main house still stood on the hill, impressive but no longer intimidating. The stables looked the same. The paddock where he'd worked with Midnight was empty now, just grass and fence posts. Can I help you? Caleb turned to find Catherine Creed standing behind him. She'd aged well, 31 or 32 now, confident and professional in riding clothes that suggested she actually worked the ranch instead of just owning it. Caleb Vance, he said. Not sure if you remember. I remember. The man who married Eliza. Her expression was complicated, mixing curiosity with something that might have been guilt. Is she here with you? No, I'm just passing through, visiting someone. Ended up here without meaning to. Catherine nodded slowly. How is she? Eliza, I mean. We heard you own a ranch in Colorado now, that you're doing well, but nobody knows details. She's good. Running our business operations, raising 2 kids, teaching herself veterinary medicine in her spare time. She's remarkable. Something flickered across Catherine's face. Regret. Definitely regret. I'm glad. We weren't kind to her, my sisters and me. We were young and stupid and following our father's lead, but that's not an excuse. If you talk to her, she paused. Tell her I'm sorry. It won't fix anything, but maybe it matters anyway. I'll tell her. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, two people connected by history but separated by everything that history meant. The horse you trained, Catherine said eventually. Midnight. Father sold him after you left, couldn't stand looking at him, said he was a reminder of being outsmarted. I've always wondered what happened to him. He's at our ranch, healthy, happy, teaches young horses how to trust humans. He's good at it. Catherine smiled sadly. Of course he is. Animals always know who to trust. She turned to leave, then paused. You won the bet, you know. Not the way Father intended, not the prize he meant to give you. But you won anyway. I hope you know that. After she walked away, Caleb stood there thinking about winning and losing, about prizes and consolations, about how the best things in life often came disguised as defeats. He visited Garrett twice more before leaving Red Hollow. On the final visit, the old trainer was barely conscious, slipping in and out of awareness. But he surfaced long enough to grip Caleb's hand with surprising strength. Take care of her, Garrett whispered. Take care of all of them, the broken ones, the overlooked ones. They need people like you. I will. Good man. The grip loosened. Good man. Garrett died 3 days after Caleb returned home. The news came via telegram, brief and factual. Caleb read it to Eliza in their kitchen while Tommy played nearby and Sarah napped upstairs. He was a good man, Eliza said quietly. He was. Crusty and difficult, but good where it counted. Did he tell you what he needed to say? Caleb thought about the conversations they'd had, about Creed's death and Catherine's apology and the complicated nature of forgiveness. Yeah, he told me everything that mattered. Life moved forward, because that's what life did. The ranch grew. Tommy started helping with simple tasks around the stables, showing natural talent with horses that made Caleb's chest tight with pride. Sarah followed her brother everywhere, determined not to be left behind despite being 3 years younger. They fought constantly and loved fiercely, the way siblings did. More employees joined their operation. More difficult horses arrived and eventually left transformed. More clients spread the word that if you needed honest work and genuine care, the Vance Ranch delivered. Eliza completed her informal education in equine medicine and started consulting on difficult cases, combining Webb's theoretical knowledge with her own observations. Other ranchers began writing to her for advice, and she answered every letter with careful attention and genuine interest in solving problems. You could charge for this, Caleb pointed out one evening, watching her work through another stack of correspondence. Maybe eventually. Right now, I'm still learning. You know more than most trained veterinarians. Knowing and proving are different things. I don't have credentials, just experience. Until that changes, I'm not comfortable taking money. It was pure Eliza, cautious about claiming expertise she hadn't formally earned, even while demonstrating that expertise daily. Caleb loved her for it, even when it frustrated him. The ranch's 10th anniversary arrived without ceremony. They were too busy with spring foaling season to celebrate properly. But that night, after the children were asleep, Caleb and Eliza sat on their porch with whiskey and watched the sun set over their land. 10 years, Eliza said, since Red Hollow. Feels longer, feels like a different life. It was a different life. We were different people. Caleb thought about the man he'd been. Angry, stubborn, desperate to prove his worth to people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered. And Eliza hidden away and convinced she had nothing to offer except in the margins where nobody looked. Do you ever regret it? He asked. How we started? The humiliation? The public mockery? My father using me as the punchline to his cruel joke? Eliza was quiet for a moment. Sometimes I regret the circumstances, but I don't regret where we ended up. This life, this ranch, you and our children, I wouldn't trade any of it for a conventional courtship and traditional marriage to someone who never saw past my limp. Even the hard parts, the fights, the struggling, all of it, especially the hard parts. They taught us how to be partners instead of just spouses, how to build something real instead of something pretty. She looked at him. You asked me once if I loved you. I said yes, but I don't think I understood what that meant yet. Now I do. Love isn't the butterflies and poetry people talk about. It's choosing someone every day, even when they're difficult. It's building something together that's bigger than either of you alone. It's work, and it's worth it. Caleb took her hand, feeling calluses that matched his own. I asked the wrong question back then anyway. Should have asked if you were willing to try. That's what mattered. We're still trying, every day. Yeah, we are. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their land darken as night fell. Somewhere in the stables, horses shifted and settled. In the bunkhouse, their employees were finishing dinner. Upstairs, their children slept soundly. Everything was imperfect and honest and real. 2 years later, they received visitors. Caleb was working with a particularly difficult mare when one of the ranch hands came running. "Boss, you got guests. Fancy ones." He found a carriage stopped in front of the main house, expensive enough to stand out in their practical operation. The door opened, and Margaret Creed stepped out. She looked older, 35 now, still beautiful, but in a way that seemed more lived in than constructed. She wore traveling clothes that were fine quality but practical, and her expression was nervous. "Mr. Vance," she said formally, "I hope we're not intruding. I wrote ahead, but perhaps the letter didn't arrive." "No letter reached us, but you're welcome regardless." Caleb gestured toward the house. "My wife is inside with the children. I assume you're here to see her? If she's willing to see me. I'd understand if she refused." They walked to the house together, Margaret taking in the ranch with obvious interest. "It's impressive. Everything people said about your operation, it's all true. We work hard." "I can see that." Eliza was in the kitchen when they entered, teaching Sarah how to measure ingredients for bread. She looked up, saw Margaret, and went completely still. "Hello, Eliza," Margaret said quietly. "Margaret," Eliza's voice was carefully neutral. "This is unexpected." "I know. I should have written, should have asked permission, but I was afraid you'd say no. And I needed to see you, needed to apologize in person for," she gestured helplessly, "for everything, for how we treated you, for standing by while Father made you invisible, for not defending you when you needed it most." Sarah tugged on Eliza's sleeve. "Mama, who's this?" "This is your Aunt Margaret, one of my sisters." Eliza's expression was complicated, mixing old hurt with present uncertainty. "Sarah, why don't you go find your brother? Tell him we have a guest." After Sarah left, the three adults stood in awkward silence until Eliza finally spoke. "Why now? It's been 12 years. Why come apologize now?" Margaret's composure cracked slightly. "Because I have a daughter of my own now, and when I look at her, I imagine someone treating her the way we treated you, and it makes me sick. I can't change the past, but I can at least acknowledge it, take responsibility for my part in it. Acknowledgement doesn't erase damage. I know, but maybe it's a start towards something better." Eliza was quiet for a long moment, and Caleb could see the war happening behind her eyes. Part of her wanted to send Margaret away, to protect herself from people who'd already hurt her once. Part of her wanted to hear more, to understand whether this apology was genuine or just guilt-seeking absolution. "Stay for dinner," Eliza said finally. "Meet my children, see what we've built. Then we'll talk about whether there's anything worth salvaging between us." Margaret looked relieved and terrified in equal measure. "Thank you." Dinner was tense at first. Margaret clearly didn't know how to interact with children, which Tommy and Sarah found hilarious and exploited mercilessly. But she tried, asking questions and listening to their enthusiastic answers about horses and ranch life and the baby goat they were raising. Watching Margaret struggle and persist reminded Caleb that people could change. Not easily, not perfectly, but genuinely if they wanted it badly enough. After dinner, Eliza and Margaret walked the property together while Caleb managed bedtime routines. When Eliza finally returned, her expression was softer than it had been. "She's trying," Eliza said simply. "It doesn't fix everything, but it's something. We'll see." Margaret visited 3 more times over the following year, and slowly, carefully, something like a relationship began forming between the sisters. Catherine came once too, bringing business questions and ending up staying for a week to learn their training methods. Victoria sent letters but never visited. Politics kept her busy, she claimed, though Caleb suspected she was simply too uncomfortable facing her past behavior. The reconciliation wasn't smooth or complete. There were still moments of tension, old resentment surfacing unexpectedly. But there was also genuine effort, and that mattered more than perfection. "Family is complicated," Eliza told Tommy one evening when he asked why his aunts had been mean to his mama before. "Sometimes people hurt each other, even when they love each other, and sometimes it takes years to fix that hurt. But trying to fix it is important, even when it's hard." "Did they fix it?" "We're working on it, still working." Oh, like training horses? Eliza laughed. Yes, actually, exactly like training horses. The years accumulated. Tommy grew into a teenager with his mother's intelligence and his father's stubbornness, passionate about veterinary medicine and determined to get formal education Eliza had never had. Sarah inherited her mother's gift for seeing potential in broken things and her father's refusal to give up on difficult cases. They hired more staff, expanded the facilities, bought additional land. The ranch became known throughout 3 territories as the place that could handle horses nobody else wanted. But they also trained regular horses, ran breeding programs, consulted on difficult cases. They'd found the balance Caleb and Eliza had argued about years ago. Idealism tempered by practicality, mission sustained by profit. Harrison Webb visited twice before he died, delighted to see Eliza's application of his teachings and eager to discuss new techniques. He left her his entire medical library in his will, hundreds of books and journals that became her most treasured possessions. Midnight lived to 22, dying peacefully in his sleep surrounded by the herd he'd helped train. Caleb and Eliza buried him on the ranch with full honors, and their children cried because they'd grown up with the old stallion and couldn't imagine the stables without him. He had a good life, Caleb told them. Better than anyone thought possible when we first met him. That matters. Will you tell us the story again? Sarah asked. About how you and Mama met? So Caleb did, and Eliza filled in the parts he forgot or got wrong. They told it honestly, the humiliation, the cruelty, the public mockery. But they also told the part about choosing each other anyway, about building something real from unpromising beginnings, about learning that the best victories often looked like defeats at first. That's a weird love story, Tommy observed. Most real ones are, Eliza replied. The neat, perfect ones are usually fiction. When Caleb turned 50, they threw a party at the ranch. Employees, clients, friends, even Margaret and Catherine with their families. It was loud and chaotic and imperfect, children running everywhere and adults talking over each other, and someone's horse getting loose and causing minor havoc. Standing in the middle of it all, Caleb felt a contentment he couldn't have imagined in his younger years. This messy, complicated, beautiful life, built from nothing, sustained by work, enriched by love, was everything he'd never known to want. You look happy, Eliza said, appearing beside him. I am happy, surprised by it sometimes, but happy. Why surprised? Because this isn't what I was chasing when I made that bet with your father. I was after status, security, proof that I mattered. And I got none of those things the way I expected, but I got everything that actually matters instead. Eliza smiled, the same smile that had caught his attention at the paddock fence all those years ago. You got me. The consolation prize. Best prize I ever won. That's a terrible line. You married me anyway. I did. Still not sure why. Because I'm charming and handsome and an excellent horse trainer. You're stubborn and difficult, and you snore. But I listen when you're right, and you're right about most things. Most things, Eliza agreed. Not everything. They stood together watching their life unfold around them. The ranch they'd built, the family they'd raised, the people they'd helped. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But it was honest and real and worth every difficult moment it had taken to create. Later that night, after the guests had left and the children were asleep and the ranch had settled into peaceful quiet, Caleb and Eliza sat on their porch one more time. What do you think he'd say? Eliza asked. My father, if he could see this. I don't know. Does it matter? Not really, but I'm curious. Caleb thought about Sheriff Dalton Creed, the man who'd tried to humiliate them both, who'd used his own daughter as a weapon, who designed a bet specifically to create failure. What would he say about the ranch they'd built? The reputation they'd earned? The family they'd raised? I think he'd hate it, Caleb said finally. Because it proves he was wrong about everything that mattered. Wrong about you, wrong about worth, wrong about what makes a life valuable. And men like him can't stand being wrong. Good. Let him be wrong. He's dead, Eliza, has been for years. I know, but his wrongness outlived him, and our rightness will outlive us. That's what matters. She was correct, as usual. They'd built something that would continue after them, not just the ranch, but the principles behind it. That damaged things could heal, that overlooked people had value, that choosing someone wasn't about finding perfection, but about committing to growth. Their children would carry those lessons forward, and maybe their children's children. And maybe, eventually, those lessons would reach someone who needed them as desperately as Caleb and Eliza had needed them in Red Hollow's town square all those years ago. "Tell me something," Caleb said. "If you could go back to that moment, standing there while everyone laughed, waiting for me to reject you, would you change anything?" Eliza considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "I'd want to skip the humiliation, the public mockery, the cruelty, but the result?" She took his hand. "No, I wouldn't change where we ended up, because this, us, our children, our life, is worth every hard moment it took to get here. Even the parts where we almost didn't make it, especially those parts. They taught us who we really were." They sat in silence, holding hands, watching the stars emerge over their land. Somewhere in the distance, a horse whinnied, one of the new arrivals probably, still adjusting to their environment. Tomorrow they'd start the patient work of earning its trust, teaching it that this place was safe, that humans could be kind. It was the same work they'd been doing for 20 years, the same work they'd continue doing until they couldn't anymore. And it never got old because every horse was different, every challenge unique, every success a reminder that broken things could heal if given proper care, just like people could. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of grass and horses and home. Caleb breathed it in, memorizing this moment, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. This was his life, their life, built from nothing, sustained by work, enriched by love. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything.